Just Stop Oil have in the past broken the law. I remember distinctly the Dartford crossing. That ended up with 2 jailed, I believe, if I remember correctly. Is it ever justified in your view?
Hi, yeah, thanks so much for having me on. I mean, I would have to say yes. I mean, we're trying to preserve my life, your lives, the lives of your family, and it's not just the planet that we're trying to protect, it's the lives of millions of people. And you know, we know from history that we have to break the law in order to put pressure on the government and to be listened to.
No one would doubt your sincerity in your views. You genuinely believe in what you fight for. But there are others who think differently. For example, there are Islamist extremists who believe that people will go to hell unless they convert to Islam. They will sincerely, perhaps, break the law in order to force people to convert. In their view, they might be saving people's lives for eternity. There might be abortion activists who say that babies are being murdered and to save their lives we need to break the law to stop people having abortions. Why do you get to say that your moral conviction is the one that's right and other people's individual moral conviction are those that are wrong?
So what's really integral to the Just Stop Oil campaign is the fact that it is a non-violent campaign. That's what separates us from the examples that you've just given. We're absolutely dedicated non-violence, both as a tactic and as a principle. So though we might be breaking the law...
If individuals take it upon themselves to break the law for whatever their course is, surely the way that we decide what society wants in general is democratic and within the law.
Well, of course, we know also that protest is absolutely integral to maintaining and upholding a democracy, and in particular, non-violent protest. I mean, I really can't express to you how severe this situation is, and I'm sure you know this.
I'm Michelle Dewberry, and I'm not here to tell you what to think. I'd much rather hear what you have to say. So, send in your opinions to gbviews@gbnews.com. Keep them clean, and you never know, I might read them out. With my panel here on Jubes & Co, we debate, we get stuck into the issues of the day on a show where all views are welcome, especially yours. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Good afternoon, Britain. It's 12 o'clock on Wednesday, the 14th of February.
Labour meltdown. With the party's polling lead tumbling, have Labour's series of catastrophic U-turns begun to catch up with them? Keir Starmer insists his party has changed, but now faces calls to investigate 5 more candidates.
It's revealed the Home Office has bought thousands of properties for asylum seekers, despite Britain's acute housing shortage. The government pledged to prioritise British homes for British workers. So is it saying one thing, but doing another?
And tech attack. London Mayor Sadiq Khan claims a fake audio clip of him nearly led to serious disorder ahead of Armistice Day. With boffins improving this scary tech every day, is our democracy under threat from artificial intelligence simulating politicians and duping the general public? There's been some interesting polling out today, hasn't there, Tom?
There has. The Labour Party tumbling down by 7 or 8 points. Now, that still means they've got a significant polling lead, but it's far from the 20 points that they had in the last few months. They've had an enormous polling lead for a long, long time, and today we're starting to see some evidence that that's coming down, and that's important. That matters because it shows that there is perhaps cut-through to the general sense of chaos within the Labour Party.
So you don't necessarily think it's down to the resurfacing of accusations of anti-Semitism, but more about the general feeling that Keir Starmer is perhaps slow to act, that he's flip-flopping on major decisions at every corner, and that essentially he may not have control over his party?
Well, I think that is a really, really important thing, this sense of sort of ill-discipline or not being strong, being weak as a leader. That's really, really damaging, and people don't really need to know every single particular. But the other fascinating thing is that the Savanta poll that we're talking about most primarily, actually its research date finished on Sunday. So that was before the Labour Party U-turned on this issue in Rochdale, but after they U-turned on the 28 billion. So I wonder if this isn't as low as the Labour Party goes. It will be very, very important to look at where polls are at the start of next week, because that will encompass what has happened in the last few days and all of these candidates that have begun to be dropped. Is this going to cut through? That's a big question.
It is a big question. Do you at home think it's going to cut through? Let us know, gbviews@gbnews.com. And I've got another question too. Why do you think parts of the left have such a problem with anti-Semitism? Of course, we see it on the right of politics too, but there seems to be a particular tendency on the left, within the Labour Party and other sections of the left, that this is a problem. Why do you think that is? gbviews@gbnews.com. But first, your headlines.
Emily, thank you. Good afternoon. These are your top stories from the GB Newsroom. The rate of inflation remains at 4%, despite forecasters predicting a rise. It's the same as in December and below economists' expectations, including the Bank of England. Figures from the Office for National Statistics found that food prices fell on a monthly basis for the first time since September 2021. The Prime Minister has insisted the economy has turned a corner as he held his first British Council meeting today. However, Chancellor Jeremy Hunt says more needs to be done.
Inflation never falls in a straight line, and although it's welcome that it hasn't gone up today, it is still double the target level of 2%, and we're not going to be able to relieve pressure on families until we hit that target and the Bank of England feels able to reduce interest rates. So this is a time to stick to a plan that is clearly working, but we need to make sure that we really get to that end point of inflation at 2%.
Residents in Birmingham told us it's little comfort when people are living paycheck to paycheck.
It's getting very difficult for us to live. Financially, we're having to spend more and more on gas and electric, and the food prices are going up. We're not buying things that we would normally buy. We're going for own brand things, like in shops, instead of going like Heinz, for example.
I mean, if I want to keep warm, I have to pay the 50, 60 pounds. Otherwise, I will have to be cold in order for the cost to be less.
I think that everybody, in some sense, are cutting back on luxury items. I know myself, indeed I have. I dare not mention that it's a funny old day today being Valentine's Day.
Pressures mounting for Sir Keir Starmer as the second Labour Party candidate's been suspended following accusations of anti-Semitism. Graham Jones allegedly suggested British people who volunteer to fight with Israel Defence Forces should be locked up. It comes a day after Labour withdrew support for the party's candidate for the Rochdale by-election, Azhar Ali, for suggesting Israel had taken the October 7th Hamas assault as a pretext to invade Gaza. Sir Keir vowed yesterday that his party has changed under his rule. A London theatre has banned a comedian from performing after Jewish audience members were reportedly hounded out of a show. Paul Curry presented both a Ukrainian and Palestinian flag to the audience during the performance. He's been accused of encouraging the crowd to chant and shout at Israeli ticket holder Liav Eitan after he refused to stand and applaud the Palestinian flag. Soho Theatre in central London has apologised and it says it's looking into the incident. There are reports his next show could be cancelled. Mr Eitan told GB News he felt excluded after the incident.
You know, in the last 5 minutes of his show, since he produced those two flags, like, I was taken immediately out of the show. Like, in my head, I was...
You felt excluded?
Yeah, excluded, and just in my mind, I was just, like, thinking about how unfair this comparison is. I just really didn't agree with that statement.
Train drivers at 5 rail operators have voted to continue taking strike action for 6 months. ASLEF announced that its members in Chiltern, C2C, East Midlands, Northern and Transpennine Railways had overwhelmingly backed carrying on with the action. Unions involved in pay disputes have to reballot their members every 6 months on continuing with industrial action. Shoplifting has hit a record high, according to the British Retail Consortium, with almost 17 million incidents recorded last year. That's more than double compared to the year before, which was at 8 million. The amount lost to shoplifting cost retailers around £1.8 billion, a record sum and the first time it surpassed the £1 billion mark. Violence and abuse against shop workers also spiked last year, with around 1,300 incidents daily. Shadow Home Secretary Yvette Cooper calls the figures shocking and describes the escalation as a failure on law and order. A damning new report of Bedford Prison describes it as filthy and some of the worst conditions seen. The HM Chief Inspector of Prisons, Charlie Taylor, described a number of problems at Bedford Prison, describing them as a damning indictment of the state of prisons. Mr Taylor says the neglected jail needs sustained support in order to improve. It can hold around 400 inmates and has a history of problems, including riots in 2016. Mr Taylor, therefore, called for it to be put into emergency measures last year. And sorry to say, for those of you planning a romantic night in and ordering a takeaway for Valentine's Day, you might need to rethink your plans. Deliveroo and Uber Eats food deliveries are set to be hit by a huge strike in the UK, as thousands of drivers will be walking out later today between 5 and 10 p.m. Delivery Job UK, an umbrella representation of gig economy workers, has arranged that strike to demand better pay and working conditions for food delivery workers. For the latest stories, sign up to GB News Alerts by scanning the QR code on your screen or go to gbnews.com/alerts.
Good afternoon, Britain. It's 8 minutes past 12 and the Labour Party is in turmoil today as Sir Keir Starmer is forced to drop a second parliamentary candidate due to alleged anti-Semitic comments. That's according to The Telegraph. Which is reporting that 5 more are being potentially pressured to investigate.
Yes, so Graham Jones is said to have used an expletive to refer to Israel and said British people who fight in their defence forces should be locked up.
It comes as Labour staff file a complaint against Sue Gray's handling of a leak inquiry, an apparent escalation of hostilities between party officials and the Chief of Staff. All of this ahead of 2 crucial by-elections tomorrow.
Yes, so Christopher Hope, GB News political editor, joins us from Westminster. Looking at the polls today, the Labour's lead is narrowing. Is it due to everything that's going on with Rochdale and accusations of anti-Semitism?
Well, the answer to that is probably no. As Tom said, this poll out from Savanta, those numbers again, Labour down 5 at 41%, Tories up 2 at 29%, so just a 12-point difference. That finished on Sunday, so really before this story broke about the Rochdale candidate and before he was disowned by the party on Monday night. So we haven't really seen anything to impact the polls. That may be, this fall may have been hit by the party's decision last week to drop this commitment to spend £28 billion a year in the second half of the next Parliament on green measures to try and green the economy. We don't yet know what the impact will be on the Rochdale row. We will know probably sooner than anything else is how it might affect the party support in Wellingborough and Kingswood. This double by-elections are held tomorrow, Thursday. Results out first thing Friday morning, and GB News will be covering this through the night. As Tom knows, it'll be quite an exciting night, as we are the election channel after all. That's the first big opinion poll, I think, on this almost self-inflicted wound on the party. I say self-inflicted because when you're in opposition, your main job is to think of good ideas and find good candidates to be MPs and then form a government. Now, on those 2 ideas, finding good candidates for MPs and ideas, they appear to be falling down. And that's why I think there's a wobble in the polls, a wobble in the confidence for Sir Keir Starmer. He's miles ahead in the polls. But many would say, has the party what's it done to deserve that lead? The Tories have imploded after the various new leaders they've had, Boris Johnson, Partygate, Liz Truss, disastrous budget plans. So Rishi Sunak, the PM for the past 2 years, his idea is don't risk it on Labour. And increasingly, I wonder whether that idea might cut through with an electorate looking at Labour and wondering how they're getting it so wrong.
Chris, your word wobble to me seems incisive. I remember back to the 2017 election campaign when Theresa May presented herself as the strong and stable candidate, the candidate to vote for stability. Then the campaign started to wobble, a couple of hiccups, and those wobbles oscillated and went further and faster. And what was a gargantuan poll lead reduced to basically nothing. We ended with a hung parliament. I wonder if this wobble we're seeing with the Labour Party now could be similar. Sir Keir Starmer, up until today, has been presenting himself as the strong and stable candidate, the safe option, with the other party in chaos. Perhaps that narrative has begun to shift.
That's right. I was there at that press conference when Theresa May was asked if she was weak and wobbly as they reversed on that dementia tax. It was the unveiling of the Welsh Tory manifesto, I think, in Wrexham. And then I said to her, for my old job, what else will change in your manifesto? And she told me nothing has changed. And at that point, I think the electorate thought, well, a lot has changed, Theresa May. And I think that signalled, some would say, the decline in that party's fortunes at that election. I mean, you go to Keir Starmer there, Tom, and you're right. Keir Starmer came into power as Labour leader just over 2 years ago because he wasn't Jeremy Corbyn. Now, that's why he's there. He said that the past associations of the party with disgusting anti-Semitism, that's not what I stand for. I will make this party fit to govern. He's got into a mess, though, because he has agreed to follow the government on international policy on security issues, notably on Israel and Gaza, and that's obviously frustrating some elements of the party's base. Now, he's there because he's moved the party on from Jeremy Corbyn, but what we're seeing in Rochdale with these two suspensions shows the party, for some people, hasn't moved on. I should say, by the way, Graham Jones, that candidate in Hyndburn, who has been suspended, he was an MP from 2010 to 2019 in Hyndburn. He's an experienced MP, a former MP, an experienced Labour politician. He wasn't standing in a by-election. I mean, how can you say, critics are saying, in fact, the Tory party is sending out emails as we speak to its members saying, Richard Holden says, Labour hasn't changed. Azhar Ali is part of the problem. Are you surprised? That's talking to their base, but will the wider electorate start to think the same too?
Thank you very much indeed, Christopher Hope there, our political editor, live from Westminster. And of course, the Labour Party will be standing, 600 candidates. The media will be very interested in what they have had to say in the past and present.
Yeah, I'm trying to do the maths in my head. 650 minus Northern Ireland. There are around, 30 seats, 30 odd seats, so maybe 620 odd candidates, perhaps. Yeah. Anyway,
yes,
the specifics don't.
Potentially under investigation already.
Yeah, but let's get more on this now. We'll speak to the Deputy Chair of the Conservative Party, Rachel McLean. Rachel, thank you for joining us. And we know that you do have an important announcement on domestic abuse that we will get to. But just to begin, do you, as a politician, feel perhaps the shifting sands of public opinion this week?
Yeah, very much so, Tom, and thanks for having me on. And I think this goes to the heart of the Labour Party and what they stand for. And we are starting to see cracks appear in the facade and the presentation that they've made to the British public that they really have changed. And what we are seeing now is evidence that really, is that true? People are starting to question that. Of course, it's been quite easy for them just to present themselves as different from the past. But I would make the point that Keir Starmer himself, I don't for one moment suggest that he's an anti-Semite himself, but he sat in the shadow cabinet with Jeremy Corbyn. He campaigned to make Jeremy Corbyn Prime Minister. And you've just highlighted there the PPC for one of the Lancashire seats, Hyndburn. He has been a Member of Parliament. He's represented his constituents in Parliament. These attitudes, I think, they seem to be, people are asking, do they go deeper than we've been led to believe? And will Keir Starmer really take the actions that he needs to, that he said he would do, to stamp out this scourge of anti-Semitism that we all found so disgusting under Jeremy Corbyn's leadership?
Well, the Israel-Gaza conflict is causing problems for the Labour Party. Of course, we've seen mobs of pro-Palestinian protests outside Labour politicians' offices and even homes, but it's also causing problems for the Conservative Party too. You've seen Tobias Ellwood in the papers this morning, his personal home address where his family live, targeted by protesters for a number of hours, shouting all sorts. There really is a growing intimidation of our politicians, isn't there?
Yeah, and these are very concerning, deeply unacceptable incidents. And I'm glad, obviously, that we, members of Parliament, we do have protections for ourselves. We have police who are there to look after us, and by and large, they do a great job. But it is always right to keep that under review. No politician, whether they're Labour, Conservative or any other party, should be intimidated for standing up and making those comments which they believe in. Freedom of speech in this country is something that's so precious. It's a foundation of our democracy. And what we are seeing is mobs on our streets now, which unfortunately have been given succor by some elements in some parties, feeling that it's okay
Rachel,
to go out and
just on that point,
it's unacceptable.
Just on that point, some people have been disappointed that Rishi Sunak hasn't stood up and made that point particularly clearly to the public, that politicians and everyone else will not be intimidated by extremists.
I think I have heard him say that on many occasions. He's been very clear, and what's more, he's acted on his words, and he's said many times that we should be able to have these debates through our democratic processes. We should not be having people intimidating others on the street. And in fact, I think just last week we passed more laws to stop people climbing on war memorials. That was something that Rishi Sunak brought in response to some of those awful, unruly and violent scenes that we saw in central London. And let's not forget the issue here is that we have people in our country, Jews, who feel unsafe on the streets. That to me is shocking. I have many Jewish friends and Jewish constituents, and we cannot have a situation when they have been threatened with the worst terrorist atrocity since the Holocaust, where they feel they're not safe in our country. Our country must continue to be a place of refuge, as it has been for so many.
Now, Rachel, the government today is announcing a new crackdown on a very specific form of domestic abuse, I suppose is the umbrella term, but it's more than that. It's punishment for people who have killed their partners.
Yeah, that's right. And I'm really glad that you've given me a chance to talk about this. I did actually serve as Minister for Victims and also in the Home Office. So this is some of the work that the government's been doing actually for a long time. We introduced the Domestic Abuse Act, which for the first time gave protections to victims of domestic abuse and has made a really huge difference in cracking down on this crime, along with the extra funding we put into the criminal justice system and police officers. But what we were seeing was this anomaly, which sometimes happens in the sentencing system, where someone who was actually applying what we call strangulation, it's basically suffocating them and strangling them for sexual gratification, that was falling through some loopholes in the sentencing system. It was not being picked up and people were not being punished effectively. There was one particular case, victim, a lady called Sophie Moss, who was sadly and tragically killed by her boyfriend at the time, and he escaped with a very, very light sentence. The sentence was shorter than he could have got for something like pet theft, or even if he'd strangled somebody but not killed them. So we felt that was wrong. We needed to change the law, and this will bring this into the statute book so that it's really, really clear that there is no such thing as this what's often called a rough sex defence, which is one of the most egregious forms of victim blaming, where the victim's families are told, well, she enjoyed this, so effectively she asked for it. No one deserves to die in the course of an intimate relationship.
No. Really well. Thank you very much for explaining that. A really, really powerful piece of new law, really. Rachel Maclean, Deputy Chair of the Conservative Party. Appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, I mean, using rough sex as a defence is just hideous, really, isn't it? And if there's loopholes in the law that allow that to be used as a defence successfully, then I'm glad that is being changed.
Well, we often talk about law and order, crime and justice on this show, and frankly, that story there, that people were getting more time or could get more time for pet theft than for killing their partner, it speaks to something that is really, really wrong in the core of crime and justice in the UK, and probably good news that that's starting to be put right.
Well, it sounds as though it is, but coming up, something else that may have got some of you scratching your heads. The Home Office is forking out for many, many thousands of homes for asylum seekers, and of course this comes amidst a rather acute housing shortage. We'll find out more. This is Good Afternoon Britain on GB News.
Welcome to your latest GB News weather update with me, Annie, from the Met Office. There'll be further outbreaks of rain for many of us through the rest of the day, and it's going to be a very cloudy but an exceptionally mild few days. That's as we've got this very mild air pushing up from the south, spreading across the country, but the far north of Scotland will still be holding on to that colder air for the time being, and there will be the best of the sunshine across the far north of Scotland through the rest of the day as well. However, elsewhere, there'll be a lot of cloud around. Outbreaks of rain mainly across parts of Northern Ireland, central southern Scotland, northern England too, as well as the south coast where we could see some quite heavy bursts. But elsewhere where we don't see the rain, there's still going to be quite a lot of cloud around, but it will be feeling very mild through the evening and overnight as well. We'll see another band of rain push in from the southwest through the course of the night. Ahead of that, in the far north of Scotland, could get down to 1 or 2 degrees, so a chillier start to the evening. But elsewhere, across many areas of the UK, it'll be another cloudy, mild and damp night. So it could be a bit of a murky start tomorrow. There's a lot of low cloud around for the next few days, but we'll see the worst of the rain through Thursday pushing in from the west this time. So eastern areas will probably get away with a largely dry day. And if we do start to see any breaks in the cloud, any sunny spells coming through, temperatures could climb as high as 16, possibly 17 degrees, which is exceptionally mild for the time of year. But further west, there is a risk of some localised flooding. See you later.
In the GB Newsroom, we bring you the news as it happens. With our team of dedicated journalists across the UK, we're ready to give you accurate reporting every day. When the news breaks, we'll be there with bulletins on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Wake up to the headlines with Headliners every morning at 5 a.m. We treat you to the day's biggest stories before anyone else, 7 days a week. You can catch up on everything you need to know before you've even had your kippers. Headliners every morning at 5 a.m, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I think the most exciting bit for me is talking to people.
People who I think are ignored often by the major news channels. We're going to give news they want to hear. There's a voice there that needs to be heard. I think there's a chance here for a diversity of opinion to be expressed, which you don't find elsewhere. It's really exciting.
We don't hold back. We're free to say how decisions that are taken here
affect us all around the country. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Good afternoon, Britain. It's 24 minutes past 12, and it's been revealed that the Home Office is reserving 16,000 homes for asylum seekers, with private landlords reportedly being offered a fully paid 5-year tenancy to take them in.
Well, why wouldn't they say no then? But with Brits currently struggling to find affordable accommodation, there are concerns the plans could deplete much-needed homes for young workers and families. Of course, there are always trade-offs. Joining us is the founder of Landlord Action, Paul Champlina. Paul, this is quite a good offer then from the Home Office to private landlords. We'll secure a 5-year tenancy for you. You don't need to worry about your property for 5 years. You know you're going to get the cash when you're due it. Quite a good deal.
Well, I don't think you can blame landlords. I think you've got to blame the government for the debacle that we're in with regard to the housing shortage that we've got. I mean, look, there's £8 million a day being spent in hotels. They're closing 50 hotels. They have closed 50 hotels down with asylum seekers, plan to close another 50 down by the end of the year. I mean, look, we've got 1.2 million people on council waiting lists, and We have a rental stock crisis. It's what can I say? It's decades and decades of failure to build social housing and affordability of housing. You know, only last year, Emily, there was only 9,000 council properties built in 2023, which was a disgrace.
No, it's an interesting point that you raised there, Paul. Do you think that to some extent, where people have been saying get asylum seekers out of hotels but then not building new accommodation on, for example, former RAF sites, there's been a lot of campaigning about where people shouldn't be put, and therefore perhaps what happens is that they then go into stuff that is already built rather than building new things?
Look, Tom, that is the trade-off. I mean, you know, I drove past an RAF, an old site in Lincoln, and I think that's the site you're talking about. And there was loads of campaigning. They're intense, and they're campaigning night after night not to have them put in that facility. You know, putting housing asylum seekers in streets, in housing multiple occupation, in normal residential properties, that can be challenging because obviously there's integration and there's a lot of issues. I mean, we just have a massive housing crisis. I've been in this industry for 34 years. I've never known a housing crisis like it. Affordability for tenants is a massive problem. I mean, just alone, there's 105,000 households in temporary accommodation, 10% increase from last year, which 62% of those have children.
Well, there's a housing crisis, but there's also the question of priorities, isn't there? And the government comes out and says British homes for British workers, British people should get priority when it comes to social housing lists. And then you see that the government is actually buying up huge numbers of properties to go directly to asylum seekers, while there are workers and young families and British people who haven't got a look in.
That's what's happened, Emily. That's the reality. The government are doing something now where they're desperate for properties because obviously we've had a big migration of asylum seekers, and the affordability of 8 million. But let's just think about that: £8 million a day is being spent at hotels. I mean, I can give you an example. I put on a charity boxing event every year, and it was the Holiday Inn in North London, and it's been closed for 4 years. Not open for the public. I mean, it is a big issue. There's a lot of hotels that have been closed down. What they're trying to do is they're reaching out to landlords and saying, we take 5-year leases.
Well, are the government undercutting the average person on the street with this? Because they're promising 5 years tenancy. Presumably they can get a better deal because they can pay for it in advance. Is that what's happening here?
Well, yeah, I mean, look, landlords are individuals, they're not banks. Let's be very clear about that. There's 2.4 million landlords out there. There's 4.4 million households out there. Landlords are contacted, whether it's by councils or by the Home Office. And if they are offered a 5-year lease, which means that they don't have any void periods, the property being empty, they look after the property, then they will sign up for it. It is a supply and demand, as I said, within crisis. And, I think the answer is, from what I've just said to you, it is decades of house building failure, of affordability. And I think that the answer of 9,000 properties being built last year, Emily, says it all, doesn't it?
No, well, Paul Champlina, thank you so much for talking us through this really concerning issue here. Fascinating to get the perspective there from the founder of Landlord Action.
Yes, good stuff. I mean, it is, of course, asylum seekers need to have somewhere to live. But when the government continues to be unable to control our borders and also unable to build enough housing for everyone, it's not great for social cohesion, is it?
And frankly, asylum seekers shouldn't be living in taxpayer-funded housing for more than a very, very short period of time. If we had an effective processing system where someone comes, are you a genuine asylum seeker? No, get out. Yes, come and get a job and pay for your own housing. The fact that they're sitting in this limbo for years, that no one wants that.
Yeah, I just really feel for, people who have been waiting on social housing lists for years, if not decades, and then they see, stories like this. Well, the reality. Anyway, the Home Office says they're working on a range of accommodation options to reduce the unacceptable use of hotels, which cost £8 million a day. That may be true, But it doesn't make it, you know, desirable.
Well, out of hotels into private rented accommodation. I mean, it's not a win, is it?
No,
it's a shift.
It's not a win at all. But next, we're going to be talking about some shocking new figures that have come through, and it shows that abuse on retail staff just going about their jobs in retail has risen by 50% in just a year. It's quite extraordinary.
Emily, thank you very much. Your top stories from the GB newsroom. The rate of inflation remains at 4%, the same as in December, despite forecasters having predicted a rise. Figures from the Office for National Statistics found that food prices fell on a monthly basis for the first time since September 2021. Shadow Chancellor Rachel Reeves criticised the figure, saying Conservatives cannot fix the economy because they're the reason it's broken. The Prime Minister has insisted, though, that the economy has turned a corner as he held his first Business Council meeting of the year today. However, Chancellor Jeremy Hunt says more needs to be done.
Inflation never falls in a straight line, and although it's welcome that it hasn't gone up today, it is still double the target level of 2%. And we're not going to be able to relieve pressure on families until we hit that target and the Bank of England feels able to reduce interest rates. So this is a time to stick to a plan that is clearly working, but we need to make sure that we really get to that end point of inflation at 2%.
Pressures mounting for Sir Keir Starmer as a second Labour Party candidate has been suspended following accusations of anti-Semitism. Graham Jones allegedly suggested British people who volunteered to fight with Israel Defence Forces should be locked up. That comes a day after Labour withdrew support for the party's candidate for the Rochdale by-election, Azhar Ali, for suggesting Israel had taken the October 7th Hamas assault as a pretext to invade Gaza. Sir Keir vowed yesterday that his party has changed under his rule. Train drivers at 5 rail operators have voted to continue taking strike action for 6 months. ASLEF announced that its members on Chiltern, C2C, East Midlands, Northern and Transpennine railways had overwhelmingly backed carrying on with the action. Unions involved in pay disputes have to reballot their members every 6 months on continuing with industrial action. And shoplifting has hit a record high, according to the British Retail Consortium, with almost 17 million incidents recorded last year. That's more than double compared to the year before, which was 8 million. The amount lost to shoplifting cost retailers around £1.8 billion, a record sum and the first time it surpassed the £1 billion mark. For all the latest stories, you can sign up to GB News Alerts by scanning the QR code on your screen or go to gbnews.com/alerts.
In the GB newsroom, we bring you the news as it happens. With our team of dedicated journalists across the UK, we're ready to give you accurate reporting every day. When the news breaks, we'll be there with bulletins on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Lee Anderson's Real World, Fridays from 7 p.m.
Dr. Jane Jones, who's the clinical lead for Care After Combat.
Yep.
Jane, thanks for coming. And just tell me a little bit about your organisation. What do you do?
OK, well, thank you for having me here so we can talk about Care After Combat. So we are an organisation, a charity, who work into the prison system, working with military veterans who've somehow got involved with the justice system and...
So there's quite a high population of ex-servicemen and women in our prisons. Why is that, do you think?
So 2014, the government did a review of who was resident in UK prisons, and what they found were that military veterans are the highest occupational group, and this obviously raises some concerns. Yeah. So the government wanted to do something about that, and so they supported Care After Combat initially just as a scoping exercise, really, to see if there was any way we could help these men and women actually, understand the problems that led to offending behaviour and go on to lead successful lives.
So what sort of offending behaviour are we talking typically for people that's in prison that's actually served in our armed forces?
Primarily, it's violence.
Yeah.
So that is the highest offence that we work with.
Okay.
But of course, the military, as with everybody else, it's the full range of offender behaviour.
OK, so we're in a pub, Jane, Dr. Jane, And I guess for some people, you know, the odd tip of alcohol is good, a bit of fun of a weekend, relax, let your hair down. But for some people, alcohol is not always their best friend, and I guess that plays a part in some of your veterans that end up inside.
Absolutely. So, speaking from my own experience, a good 2/3 of the people I work with have some kind of mental health problem or mental health difficulty, struggling to either adapt into civilian life or with some of the traumas they've experienced during service. People might self-medicate with alcohol to manage some of those thoughts and feelings.
Your weekend starts here with Friday Night Live with me, Mark Dolan, 8 till 9 on GB News. Big stories, big guests and big laughs as we get you ready for a cracking weekend. That's Friday Night Live with Mark Dolan, Fridays 8 till 9 on GB News. Bring your own drinks, the admission's free.
Have a great Saturday night with me, Leo Curse, on the Saturday Night Showdown. It's a crazy world out there, so come and make fun of it with me, my panel of comedians, and a couple of people who actually know what they're talking about. This Saturday Night Showdown is your front row ticket to the clown show every Saturday, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Right, well, UK shop workers are witnessing a surge of racial abuse, sexual harassment, physical assault and threats with weapons as incidents rise by 50% in 1 year. This is truly shocking.
Yes, criminals are being given a free pass, according to the British Retail Consortium, with pressure mounting on ministers to intervene to protect retail employees.
So, joining us now is the Chief Executive of the Association of Convenience Stores, James Lauman. James, 50% up in just 1 year. Tell us a little bit about what retail workers are facing on the day-to-day.
Yeah, in terms of the statistics, I think two things are happening. Firstly, there is more crime, there is more shop theft than there was. I think also retailers are getting better at reporting it. And certainly these are British Retail Consortium figures and ours are coming out soon. And that certainly reflects what's coming out here, a significant increase. So it's good news, retailers are getting better at reporting it, but there is still this trend of more thefts from stores. That theft is becoming more brazen and often now is leading to incidents of violence as well. So, unfortunately, this is pretty grim reading, and unfortunately, it does tally with our members' experience, certainly operating in local shops up and down the country.
I have to say, I've noticed in shops in a few areas something that I hadn't seen before, which is everyday items locked up behind little screens. This seems to be something that's started to happen in the last year or so. Is that advice that you're giving to shops?
We're not formally giving that advice, but it is happening more, and retailers are looking at everything they can do to protect their colleagues, protect their stock, protect their businesses, and that does unfortunately mean more products going behind the counter, or having other protective measures there. Sometimes you might see a product and the box is there on the shelf, but you then got to stop it at the counter for the product itself. So we're seeing much more of these things, as well as CCTV, alarm systems, guarding, all the other things, headsets, body-worn cameras, a lot of investment in these sorts of measures, which sadly are becoming almost a part of doing business in some parts of the country, and it's it's clearly an unacceptable point that we've got to. And the British Retail Consortium are actually absolutely right that we need more help. We need more help from the police to deal with this. And the governments at national level, I think, have arrived at the right strategy, which is about reporting crime every time, investigating every crime. No excuse now for saying, oh, this crime is too small in value to investigate. That's no longer an excuse. Every crime has to be investigated. And by doing that, we can identify the prolific repeat offenders who are really the cause of the vast majority of this crime. There's a perception maybe that a lot of this crime is caused by people being opportunist or stealing for their own need. In reality, this is people often with addiction problems and other issues who are going to stores, often stealing to order, reselling the products to fund those addictions. And it's those prolific repeat offenders who we need to identify and then either use custodial sentences or other measures, or it might be rehabilitation orders, whatever the most effective thing is to take that person out of the cycle of reoffending. For too long, we've ignored those individuals, ignored this problem, and it's inevitably escalated. We need to intervene. At the national level, I think the policy is right. That has to happen, though, every single police force, every single day, across the country, and unfortunately it's not right now.
And the police say they're going to follow up on every crime that is reported, but of course seeing that in practice is not always the case. But you're the Chief Exec of the Association of Convenience Stores, so presumably that includes your everyday corner shop. Now, a lot of these corner shops open till pretty late at night. Can it be quite an intimidating atmosphere? You're on your own in a small shop. You perhaps have two young men with their hoodies up, maybe masked, coming into your shop. You're not quite sure what they're going to do.
Yeah, absolutely. I think about the location of those stores as well, often in areas outside of main centres where you've got other businesses, maybe a routine police presence. These are often in villages, housing estates, those areas outside of main towns where there wouldn't be a police presence often. There might not be lots of other people around. And the fact that we're there means that the service we're providing is even more important, because without us there wouldn't be any services in that local area. But it does expose us. The good news is it means that relationships with customers are very, very good. Relationship with the community is very, very good. But yeah, without that support from the police, without a regular presence, retailers and their colleagues do find themselves in a position too often where they feel intimidated, and then too often that turns into actual incidents and violence against those people in stores. So it's not a new challenge, but it's clearly getting worse. The severity and the amount of crime in stores is getting worse, and this report today really shows that up.
It's fascinating that you say such a large proportion of this crime is committed by such a small and repeat section of offenders. It really puts the lie to the idea, perhaps the internet meme, that it's just people stealing to get by through the cost of living crisis. That really seems like that is a barefaced lie. What can you do to work with police to identify these repeat offenders and, frankly, perhaps to lock them up?
Yeah, it starts with reporting, Tom. I mean, it starts with reporting every single crime. And through that, the police can then piece together a picture. Now, that's the first link in the chain that can be broken, because the police have to investigate. They have to pull the information together. More and more forces now looking at smart, quick online reporting, so they can gather information more effectively. That's a really good step forward. But then the next step, as you said in your last comment there, really, is how does that go in terms of how does that progress to the courts? So are those people then brought to court, and are then the penalties, the sanctions used effective? And it might be locking them up, and in some cases that would be absolutely the right thing to do. It might be other measures, community orders, rehabilitation orders, and things like that. I think our members don't particularly mind. What they want is that person to be taken out of that cycle of reoffending, because they're the ones at the sharp end of that.
And the point is, no one working in a convenience store or any other shop should have to deal with racial abuse, harassment and, of course, thefts. Thank you very much indeed, James Lauman, who's the Chief Exec of the Association of Convenience Stores. It is shocking, actually, how people behave in this country.
But I think the most incisive thing there is it's usually a small group of people who've done these things before and keep doing it. And it comes up and up again in conversations we have about crime, about justice, about the idea and possibility of rehabilitation. Frankly, society, there are just some wrong-uns.
Oh, yeah.
There are just some bad people in society.
Whether it's ever justified to shoplift, that comes up time and time again, doesn't it? And
that's
people
outrageous.
People pretend it's something out of Les Miserables, where you're only stealing a loaf of bread.
Someone's just an urchin getting an apple. No, it's bloody not. No, it's not.
Well, there you go. Anyway, we're going to move on, because the Duke and Duchess of Sussex have landed in Canada to help promote next year's Invictus Games.
Yes, they make the trip from California in their private jet, which is likely to prompt some criticism of their eco-friendly credentials. Meanwhile, it's being reported that the couple did not consult the royals before they launched their revamped website, as we discussed yesterday.
Yes, well, joining us now in the studio is GB News royal correspondent Cameron Walker. As you just heard, some criticism of their eco-friendly credentials. Now, this is because Prince Harry has a whole website and a business all aimed at sustainable travel, does he not?
He does. Travelist, Emily, is what he launched. But yesterday we were talking about his other website, the new Sussex.com website. In the biography for Prince Harry, as part of that website, it says Prince Harry is an environmental campaigner. And this morning he's been pictured landing in Vancouver on a private jet with Meghan, and then he also made a separate private jet trip from Vancouver to Vancouver Island, which is about 15 nautical miles. So make of that what you will. Of course, he's perfectly entitled to travel in a private jet. He's a private citizen. I'm sure they would argue that it's all for security reasons and the timings didn't work. But there were several commercial flights available. We do know that. We also know that clearly it's now become a big distraction, because the whole point of Harry and Meghan being in Vancouver in Canada is to launch the countdown, the one-year countdown to the Invictus Games in Canada, which is Prince Harry's Olympic-style games, which he launched to help wounded veterans. So all of that's distracted because of the fact he flew on a private jet. Plus, of course, as you said, this website is continuing to cause controversy, whether or not it is hinting at potentially capitalising on their royal titles. A source told the Mail this morning, or it's been reported in the Mail at least, that Buckingham Palace was not consulted on this new website, and there's allegations that they've broken their unwritten promise to Queen Elizabeth II, where they promised not to capitalise on their royal titles. So it's all got a little bit messy.
And Cameron, in other news, the King is back in London. He arrived back in London yesterday. What have we learnt about how his treatment's going?
Yeah, so the King was pictured leaving Clarence House in the last couple of hours. It's thought he's returning to Sandringham following yet another round of outpatient treatments for his cancer diagnosis. The picture you're seeing yesterday is him arriving. The picture you're seeing on your screen is him arriving with Camilla back in London yesterday. He is expected to return to London on a regular basis to be treated as an outpatient. So he's not going to be spending the night in hospital, but he is having to return to London for this so-called pioneering cancer treatment we think he's receiving in a private hospital. Buckingham Palace are not going to be providing a running commentary on the King's health, but I think clearly the fact he is choosing even to be pictured in the Rolls-Royce with those big windows in the car. He wants to be seen. It's clearly him trying to show a message of reassurance here that, OK, he's not carrying out public engagements, OK, he's got cancer and he's receiving treatment, but behind the scenes, he's still very much the monarch and is working through his red boxes, having meetings with officials such as the Prime Minister. The Queen is still keeping calm and carrying on as well. She's staying in London for several engagements this week, so I don't think we need to panic too much.
Grand. Well, that's good to know. Thank you very much, Cameron, for updating us on those two royal stories. One positive, one perhaps more debatable.
Yes, lots of you have been getting in touch about what we were discussing about the Home Office, essentially buying up private rentals for thousands and thousands of asylum seekers. Lots of you have been getting in touch. Angie says, good programme as usual, interesting discussion. I agree they need to be housed somewhere, but not at the detriment of other people who are looking for housing. Diana asks, why are we housing asylum seekers in the first place? The daily money should be spent on extra processing stuff. She says it's crazy. And there's lots more coming through. John says this is all the Conservative Party's fault, including the shoplifting going through the roof, the sexual assaults, the cost of living, the NHS waiting list up, the lack of housing, which, yes, well,
yes.
It's true.
And Deborah has written in about her son and grandsons who've been struggling. Their rent's been going up. She says, when do young, hard-working people who cost the state nothing but give back in taxes get the help that they need? It's sickening to hear our government is more interested in helping foreigners than our own. That's what Deborah thinks.
Well, there you go. GBViews at gbnews.com if you want to join the discussion. But this is an interesting one.
It certainly is. Sadiq Khan, the Mayor of London, says an AI-generated audio clip of him supposedly making inflammatory remarks before Armistice Day nearly caused serious disorder.
Yes, the clip imitating him says, I control the Met Police. They will do as the Mayor of London tells them. And it goes on to say the British public need to get a grip.
Well, the London Mayor says that the law is not fit for purpose in tackling AI fakes, because that's what this was, artificial intelligence imitating Sadiq Khan's voice.
Yes, and apparently it was spread all over far-right groups. That's what Sadiq Khan has said, and it could have precipitated some kind of violence also.
But there's a bigger issue here. With the general election around the corner, we could see more artificial intelligence misuse for political gain.
Well, joining us now is AI policy expert Connor Axiotis. Thank you very much indeed for joining us, Connor. Sadiq Khan claiming here that an audio fake of him, AI generated, could have led to disorder on the streets and danger. Is this something we could see more of?
Yes, definitely. These models are proliferating online. Over the last year, we've seen an exponential growth in the power and capabilities of the most powerful AI models. And also, Tom spoke about us going to the polls this year. Almost 50% of the world will be going to the polls to vote in the national election in 2024. So there's a huge kind of ground for these would-be election disruptors to try and cause some mayhem here. election interference from malevolent actors isn't a novel security issue for the UK, right? This has happened for years. What is novel and what is new is that powerful AI models can help these would-be election disruptors with an army of bots rather than just, 10, 15 people in a room. They might be able to have a million bots creating deepfakes and misinformation. That's where the real issue is coming from.
Now, a lot of people might say it's quite fun. These tools, they're available publicly online now. You can speak into your computer for a few sentences and it will speak back to you other words in your own voice. Now, how do we strike the balance between saying people should have access to this incredible technology, this mimicking technology, but also we should be able to protect our elections?
You're right. And it seems that elections probably have a special place when it comes to deepfake regulation. OpenAI, one of the biggest AI right now, I've already said GPT will be used for electoral purposes. I went into the model and said, can you create me a poster for a political campaign I'm running, fictional political campaign? And it just wouldn't let me. But you're right, Tom, there's some kind of fun utility maximizing ways of using deepfakes for fun with your friends. But yeah, we just need to make...
My initial reaction is that perhaps the cons outweigh the pros of this technology, but we can have that debate. But in terms of cracking down on this type of thing, I've heard that Elon Musk, the owner now of Twitter, he's tasking his team to crack down on these. He's trying to get rid of these sort of AI clips that are going around, isn't he?
Yeah, and I think a lot of the big social media platforms are still scarred from Facebook's experience in 2016 with kind of electoral misinformation. They did that maybe they took too much stuff down in 2020, but in 2024, the big tech moguls like Musk and Zuckerberg, are really looking to make sure that this doesn't cause an issue. But there's always things we can do.
Even genie's out of the bottle, isn't it? I mean, how do we detect what is an audio clip that we hear that is fake from one that is what a politician has actually been secretly recorded saying? How do we tell the difference?
Yeah, this is a great question, Tom. The first thing you can do is, as always, with every political source you see, be vigilant, check your sources, always err on the side of skepticism. Something else that the labs are thinking of doing is called watermarking, where basically every time you're seeing fake, it will be marked by, let's say, an OpenAI moniker that can't be removed. But a lot of the people I've been speaking to, a lot of the experts say that these kind of watermarks are pretty easy to take down. So it's tough. Just always err on the side.
Tough but possible, and err on the side of caution. Thank you very much indeed, Connor Axiotis, AI policy expert. I mean, what this clip imitated with Khan is pretty dangerous. Using his voice, saying, disparaging Remembrance Weekend with an expletive, calling for pro-Palestinian marches planned for the same day to take precedence when it came to policing and so on.
And these clips can sound incredibly, incredibly simple. We've already heard cases of fraud where people have used someone's voice to say, hey, Dad, can you leave the key under the plant pot? I've forgotten my keys, and then break into a house. You can do all this sort of stuff now. Very dangerous, but much more to come. The Labour Party in disarray. Just in time for 2 crucial by-elections tomorrow. We'll be discussing much more on that, and also a further by-election at the end of the month. Election, election, election. And what could it all mean for us? What could this mean going forward? Might the polls be starting to turn? Stick around with us on Good Afternoon Britain.
A brighter outlook with Box Solar, sponsors of weather on GB News.
Hello there, welcome to your latest GB News weather update with me, Annie, from the Met Office. There'll be further outbreaks of rain for many of us through the rest of the day, and it's going to be a very cloudy but an exceptionally mild few days. That's as we've got this very mild air pushing up from the south, spreading across the country, but the far north of Scotland will still be holding on to that colder air for the time being, and there will be the best of the sunshine across the far north of Scotland through the rest of the day as well. However, elsewhere, there'll be a lot of cloud around, Outbreaks of rain mainly across parts of Northern Ireland, central southern Scotland, northern England too, as well as the south coast, where we could see some quite heavy bursts. But elsewhere, where we don't see the rain, there's still going to be quite a lot of cloud around, but it will be feeling very mild through the evening and overnight as well. We'll see another band of rain push in from the southwest through the course of the night. Ahead of that, in the far north of Scotland, could get down to 1 or 2 degrees, so a chillier start to the evening. But elsewhere, across many areas of the UK, it'll be another cloudy, mild and damp night. So it could be a bit of a murky start tomorrow. There's a lot of low cloud around for the next few days, but we'll see the worst of the rain through Thursday pushing in from the west this time. So eastern areas will probably get away with a largely dry day. And if we do start to see any breaks in the cloud, any sunny spells coming through, temperatures could climb as high as 16, possibly 17 degrees, which is exceptionally mild for the time of year. But further west, there is a risk of some localised flooding. See you later.
That warm feeling inside from Boxed Boilers, sponsors of weather on GB News.
In the GB Newsroom, we bring you the news as it happens. With our team of dedicated journalists across the UK, we're ready to give you accurate reporting every day. When the news breaks, we'll be there with bulletins on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Have a great Saturday night with me, Leo Curse, on the Saturday Night Showdown. It's a crazy world out there, so come and make fun of it with me, my panel of comedians, and a couple of people who actually know what they're talking about. This Saturday Night Showdown is your front row ticket to the clown show every Saturday, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
GB News Breakfast. Every day from 6 a.m.
Lots of people very concerned about what's happening in the Middle East. Iran obviously denying it, but the next move from the United States, our key allies, will be absolutely key.
Absolutely right. And I think there's a lot of talk about where this could go, whether the situation could be escalated. But I think the chatter is heading in the right direction, which is about de-escalation. So if there are going to be targeted sanctions against Iran, that's already happened through expelling certain diplomats and other measures there. But you can do that without arm-to-arm combat at this stage. But I think the US will be weighing up all of its options. Antony Blinken obviously gave a press conference in the United States yesterday to say that, there will be a response from the US, but it'll be at their time and it'll be in the way in which they think is the most appropriate. So all eyes are now on the United States as to when it makes that move.
Yeah, and it's fascinating, isn't it, how domestic politics plays so much into international politics. The States, they've got a presidential election this year. We've got a budget coming up. So all the noise, both sides. You've got Donald Trump saying, go a bit more hawkish, I suppose you could say, than President Biden. And here we've got all the generals. We've got the Secretary of State for Defence coming out saying, we need conscription, we need more cash. But a lot of that is part of the sort of national narratives rather than actually looking at what's happening in Iran, isn't it?
It is. I mean, it plays into, the very uncertain times that we're living. And you're absolutely right. There'll be supporters of Donald Trump who are clearly adversaries of Joe Biden to say we must act now. It's a demonstration of showing your strength. Opponents of Biden will say that the US looks weak if it doesn't take action now against Iran, who are clearly, as we know, funding these at arm's length organisations like Hezbollah in Tehran, like the Houthis who are carrying out the attacks in the Red Sea. So Iran is responsible.
Every Sunday from 11, join Michael Portillo.
There will be topical discussion, looking at the week before and the week to come. So kick back and relax at 11 a.m. on Sundays on GB News with me, Michael Portillo. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Good afternoon, Britain. It is 1 o'clock on Wednesday, the 14th of February.
Labour Party meltdown. With the party's polling lead tumbling, have Labour's series of catastrophic U-turns began to catch up with them? Keir Starmer insists his party has changed, but now faces calls to investigate 5 more candidates. We'll be joined by former Labour Party Member of Parliament, Chris Williamson.
And it's revealed the Home Office has bought thousands of properties for asylum seekers despite Britain's acute housing shortage. The government pledged to prioritise British homes for British workers, so is it saying one thing and doing quite another?
And questionable justice. 3 pro-Palestinian protesters guilty of a terror offence for wearing paraglider badges haven't been punished. Was the judge right to not jail them when others have been sent to prison for sending offensive text messages?
Well, that's a rather good question, isn't it, Tom? Is the law being applied consistently here? I mean, many of us were shocked when we saw those 3 protesters with the paragliders on their backs. The image of the Hamas paragliders on their backs clearly, in my view, showed support for the terrorist action of Hamas on October the 7th.
There was no association with anything to do with Palestine, Gaza, Israel and paragliding up until October the 7th, when paragliders flew in above the Nova Music Festival and shot people who were dancing, who were unarmed, who were civilians. It was a massacre. And these 3 people went on that pro-Palestinian march with paragliders on their backs. How can that be interpreted as anything other than the celebration of the slaughter of innocent life?
And then there's the point. What's the point of having anti-terror legislation if it doesn't actually lead to punishment? If a judge rules... They will have it on their record, presumably.
Oh, they've got a slap on the wrist on their record, yeah.
Slap on the wrist, slap on the wrist. But perhaps you might take the view at home that this is a free speech issue, that you should be able to wear whatever sign, whatever it is, regardless of its terror affiliations.
If that's the case, then why are we sending people to prison in this country for making jokes about Captain Tom? Why are we sending people to prison in this country for malicious communications? Granted, vile communications, sending effigies of Grenfell and all the like, but there are many examples of people who've gone to prison for sending bad taste jokes to their friends, and yet these 3 individuals celebrating in the slaughter of Jews walk free.
Well, we're going to have 2 lawyers go head-to-head on this very question coming up. Let us know what you think, gbviews@gbnews.com, but it's your headlines.
Emily, thank you very much and good afternoon. 3 minutes past 1, your top stories from the GB Newsroom. The rate of inflation remains at 4%, despite forecasters predicting a rise. It's the same as in December and below economists' expectations, including the Bank of England. Figures from the ONS found that food prices fell on a monthly basis for the first time since September 2021. The Prime Minister has insisted the economy has turned a corner, and he held his first Business Council meeting today. However, Chancellor Jeremy Hunt says more needs to be done.
Inflation never falls in a straight line. And although it's welcome that it hasn't gone up today, it is still double the target level of 2%. And we're not going to be able to relieve pressure on families until we hit that target and the Bank of England feels able to reduce interest rates. So this is a time to stick to a plan that is clearly working, but we need to make sure that we really get to that end point of inflation at 2%.
Pressure's mounting for Sir Keir Starmer as a second Labour Party candidate's been suspended following accusations of anti-Semitism. Graham Jones allegedly suggested British people who volunteer to fight with the Israel Defence Forces should be locked up. It comes a day after Labour withdrew support for the party's candidate for the Rochdale by-election, Azhar Ali, for suggesting Israel had taken the October 7th Hamas assault as a pretext to invade Gaza. Sir Keir vowed yesterday that his party has changed under his rule. A London theatre has banned a comedian from performing after Jewish audience members were reportedly hounded out of a show. Paul Curry presented both a Ukrainian and Palestinian flag to the audience during the performance. He's been accused of encouraging the crowd to chant and shout at Israeli ticket holder Liav Eaton after he refused to stand and applaud the Palestinian flag. Soho Theatre in central London has apologised and says it's going to look into the incident. There are reports his next show could be cancelled. Mr Eaton told GB News he felt excluded after the incident.
You know, in the last 5 minutes of his show, since he produced those 2 flags, like, I was taken immediately out of the show. Like, in my head, I was...
You felt excluded?
Yeah, excluded, and just in my mind, I was just, like, thinking about how unfair this comparison is. I just really didn't agree with that statement.
18 out of 31 NATO countries, according to its chief, are on track to meet the 2% military spending target. Jens Stoltenberg was speaking at a conference where he says overall spending is set for another record year. That's as Russia's full-fledged war against Ukraine enters its third year. He also says NATO's European states will invest a combined total of around £302 billion in defence this year. Well, those comments come as British troops departed Southampton yesterday, headed for Poland to take part in the largest NATO exercise since the Cold War to demonstrate the alliance's capabilities. Train drivers at 5 rail operators have voted to continue taking strike action for 6 months. ASLEF announced that its members on Chiltern, C2C, East Midlands, Northern and TransPennine railways had overwhelmingly backed carrying on with the action. Unions involved in pay disputes have to reballot their members every 6 months or on continuing with industrial action. Now, an inquest has been told that a man in South London was shot in the neck and chest by armed police. Convicted stalker Bryce Hodgson was shot dead on January 30th after he broke into a home in Surrey Quays. The inquest also heard Hodgson had gained entrance to the property armed with a crossbow and other weapons. And sorry to be the bearer of bad news for those planning a romantic night in and ordering a takeaway for Valentine's Day. You might need to rethink your plans. Deliveroo and Uber Eats food deliveries are set to be hit by a huge strike in the UK as thousands of its drivers will be walking out later today between 5 and 10 p.m. Delivery Job UK, an umbrella representation of the gig economy workers, has arranged that strike to demand better pay and working conditions for workers. For the latest stories, sign up to GB News Alerts by scanning the QR code on your screen or go to gbnews.com/alerts. Now back to Tom and Emily.
Good afternoon, Britain. It's 7 minutes past 1 and the Labour Party is in turmoil today as Sir Keir Starmer is forced to drop a second parliamentary candidate due to an alleged anti-Semitic comment and is being pressured to investigate 5 further candidates, according to The Telegraph.
Yes, well, Graham Jones is said to have used an expletive to refer to Israel and said British people who fight in their defence forces should be locked up.
Amidst all the chaos, brand new polling suggests the Labour lead of the Tories has suffered an enormous blow ahead of 2 crucial by-elections tomorrow.
Yes, well, let's cross to our political editor, Christopher Hope, in Westminster. Christopher, tell us how recent events may have influenced the polling.
Yeah, the polling, of course, ended on Sunday. So the polling really is a response to last week's U-turn by the party on dropping a £28 billion a year pledge in the second half of a first-term Labour government to spend on greening the economy, investing in green infrastructure. That's what that fall is down to. We should remind viewers of what those numbers are. They are quite dramatic, the Savanta figures. Down 5 points at 41%, Tories up 2, 29%, Lib Dems up 1 at 11%, Reform down 1 at 8%. So just at a 12-point differential, nowhere near the 20 points or so that we have seen in recent weeks. I should say Chris Hopkins, who's the Savanta director, says not to read too much into the single poll. But if this becomes a trend, it's a problem. And it might become a trend when new polling happens after the most recent dramas in Rochdale, where the party has disowned its candidate at the upcoming February 29th Rochdale by-election. We'll have a different form of opinion poll, of course, Tom and Emily. Tomorrow, we're having double by-elections in Wellingborough and Kingswood near Bristol. So we'll see how they end up. We've got full coverage through the night into Friday morning on GB News and also on for all day Friday about the result there. So the week is not over yet for the 2 main parties. It could end better for Sir Keir Starmer, but right now there's no question there's a wobble happening here, and these things shouldn't happen if you're in opposition. In opposition, you're meant to be, all you're dealing is corralling good ideas and finding good candidates to be MPs. When that starts going wrong, you've got a real problem.
Certainly a bit of a wobble. Well, Chris Hope, thank you very much for giving us the very latest there. Now, we have asked to speak to a sitting Labour Member of Parliament. Sadly, none has been available, but we're delighted to be joined by the former Labour Member of Parliament, Chris Williamson. Chris, first of all, this seems like it is a perennial crisis for the Labour Party. Is it your view that under Keir Starmer, things haven't changed compared to where they were before? Still further accusations of anti-Semitism?
Well, firstly, let me say that it looks like George Galloway, the Workers' Party candidate in the Rochdale by-election, is on course for a historic victory there. But yes, I mean, look, the Labour Party has certainly changed. I mean, it's really moved very much to the right, and it really isn't offering anything very much different now from the Conservative Party. And this is really thieving our democracy because, you know, elections, democracy, politics should be about giving the British people a choice, and there is no real choice now between Labour and the Conservatives. Both of them are signed up to the war machine. Both of them are very much in support of the Zionist entity in Israel and the genocide that's taking place there. And both are very much signed up to an economic agenda which has desperately failed the British people. I'm talking about the kind of neoliberal economic agenda, and there's no real difference now being offered by Labour in the election whenever it comes, which we think is probably going to be in the autumn of this year.
What do you mean when you say that both the Conservative Party and the Labour Party are signed up to the Zionist entity? What does that... Because the last time I checked, both parties support a two-state solution. Both parties support a sustainable ceasefire in the Middle East.
Well, you know, they very seem to me, anyway, to be taking their instructions from Tel Aviv, because the actions that they're taking against Labour Party members who utter the modest criticism of Israel is deemed beyond the pale. And look, criticism of Israel...
Sorry, I really don't want to interrupt you there, but I do want to just... gather what you mean by modest criticism of Israel, because the two suspensions that we've heard about in the last couple of days have spoken about Jewish quarters in the media, have spoken about this conspiracy theory that Israel wanted its own citizens to be slaughtered in the largest slaughter of Jewish people since the Holocaust.
I mean, I don't agree with that proposition, but it's not anti-Semitic to say it. Indeed, it was carried in the New York Times, amongst other august journals. So, I mean, that has been speculation.
Hang on, Chris. So it's not anti-Semitic. What about using the traditionally anti-Semitic trope of Jewish quarters in the media?
Yeah, I don't know about that, but I mean, there's no doubt that the Zionist movement in this country does exert a lot of influence over political parties, and we see that. I mean, you know, virtually half the members of the Parliamentary Labour Party are members of the so-called Labour Friends of Israel, and figures I understand relating to the Conservative Party, 80% of them are in the Conservative Party equivalent. And that's very dangerous, it seems to me, for democracy, because, you know, the elected members of Parliament should be there to represent the interests of the British people and to put Britain's interests first, not Israel's, particularly when you see a rogue state like Israel which is engaged in a genocide in Gaza. I mean, you know, nearly 30,000 people have now been slaughtered, children, tens of thousands. Saw a horrific image of a day of a little girl who's been blasted against the wall and
that we've seen various examples of people who've been able to criticise policy and criticise the actions of Israel. I can point to Jess Phillips, for example, who resigned her front-bench position. No one says she's anti-Semitic, but she's criticised what Israel is doing. Paul Bristow, the Conservative, he resigned as a front-bencher. He's critical of what Israel is doing, but no one's saying he's anti-Semitic. Can you see a material difference between these people and how they act and how they talk, and people who talk about Jewish quarters in the media influencing things and invent conspiracy theories about Israel's actions?
Well, there's no doubt that the Zionist movement in this country does have an undue influence on political parties, on the media and so on. But look, I mean, you look at the examples of people like Andy MacDonald, a member of Parliament, I think since about 2012. I think he won a by-election in Middlesbrough. I mean, he made a remark at a rally in support of the Palestinian people, where he wanted to see a situation where people living in that region, both Jews and Palestinians could live in harmony and peace together. And he was suspended and is still suspended. And I think it's unlikely he's going to be able to stand as a candidate. But look, there's factionalism going on here as well. And so what they're seeking to do is to remove as many people as they can who are on the left of the political spectrum inside
I know
the
you've jumped across to Mr McDonald, but I'm really interested about your view of Azir Ali, who I'm not quite sure if you think he should have been suspended or not. Just on this issue of what he said about the Jewish media, on this issue of what he said about the fact that Israel almost wanted its citizens to be killed, do you think those are worthy of suspension and worthy of investigation?
Well, look, Azir Ali is he's on the right of the party. He's expressed his support for Israel in the past. But this is an example, really, of where the Labour Party is yielding to pressure from the Zionist movement.
Sorry, was that a yes or a no?
About Israel. And what we're seeing is a conflation of criticism of Israel. And whatever you think about that conspiracy theory, it's not something I agree with, although, as I say, it has been carried in some detail in the New York Times, amongst other august journals, as I've said. But that doesn't constitute anti-Semitism. Criticism of Israel indulging in conspiracy theories is not the same as expressing, hatred or bigotry towards Jews. That's what anti-Semitism is, not criticism of Israel.
Chris, you're very, very happy to talk about how Israel is this genocidal / terrorist entity. I haven't seen much of you talking about Hamas and its actions in Israel and the number of people it brutally massacred, raped and killed, tortured even. Where's your disgust at that?
Well, the accusations of rape are false. The accusations of beheading babies are also false, and there's no evidence whatsoever. And indeed, some of the people that made those accusations have subsequently withdrawn them. Look, at the end of the day,
that's absolute nonsense. OK, so let's just go with the murder. Let's just go with the brutal massacre and torture there.
OK, well, look, I mean, in Palestinian resistance is an inevitable response to 75 years of Israeli oppression. I mean, Israel was created out of terrorism, actually, and out of a social cleansing exercise where 750,000 Palestinians were forcibly removed from their homes and have been subsequently unable to remove.
So essentially what Hamas did is justified in your view?
It's an inevitable consequence, I think. Palestinian resistance is an inevitable consequence of the oppression and brutality that we've seen from the Israelis.
Disgusting thing to say. That is just despicable. Despicable. Innocent Israeli people going about their daily life being brutally slaughtered by a terrorist group that is prescribed in this country and many, many other countries around the world.
Well, it's not just Hamas, of course. I mean, the Palestinian resistance... Hamas is a big continuum, but I mean, there's Islamic Jihad, there's the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. There's a range of different Palestinian resistance groups who have come together. And look, inevitably, in every situation where you have oppression, particularly where you have a settler colonial scenario that we see in Palestine right now, there is going to be a reaction. And we've had 75 years of this oppression, 1967.
Chris, Israel going to be a reaction, does that reaction include throwing hand grenades at families, about charred bodies of babies found with their heads lopped off? Now, Chris, you clearly deny that they were beheaded before they were killed, but whether they're beheaded before or after they're killed, these are beheaded babies we're talking about. We're talking about women who have examples of evidence of rape which you deny. We're talking about so much slaughter, people paragliding in, killing people at a music festival. How on earth is that resistance?
Well, look, I mean, many of the people that were killed on October the 7th were actually killed by the Israeli occupation forces. I mean, they scrambled Apache helicopters. This has been actually reported in the Israeli media. It's not just me saying this now, making anything up. This is something which was, as I've said, reported in the Israeli media. So many of those people, those charred bodies, were as a direct consequence of Israeli airstrikes and Israeli tank fire.
Chris, it's very interesting that you're so quick to dispute reports and evidence when it comes to Hamas and their activities, but you're very quick to leap on the idea that Israel is some kind of terror state.
Well,
I mean, it's very
in
interesting where you lie on this issue. I mean, it's pretty despicable, actually, really, when you think about it, isn't it, Chris?
What do you think of the genocide that's taking place in Gaza at the moment? I mean, nearly 30,000 people have been slaughtered by the Israeli regime, and they are continuing their military operation. This is absolutely despicable. Look, what we need is a permanent ceasefire, but we don't just need a ceasefire. If we're serious about bringing peace to that region, we need to bring Israel to heel. So there should be an arms embargo.
Chris, we're running out of time, but I wonder if you could help us towards that ceasefire today. Would you add your voice? It might actually carry some weight in the region. I know you've been associated with a lot of people who are close to the pro-Palestinian cause. You've been friends with people who've said they've been friends with Hamas. Why don't you say to Hamas, put your weapons down and then perhaps release the hostages? Israel say they'll stop fighting if that happens.
Well, to be fair, Tom, that's an unrealistic suggestion. There's going to be resistance inevitably while ever Israel illegally occupies and brutally oppresses the Palestinian people. And so if we're serious about an arms embargo, making pious statements like Hamas should lay down their arms, Israel should lay down their arms. And in order to bring that about, we need to be imposing an arms embargo. But you can't say Hamas should lay down its arms. No. Well, listen.
Why don't you say it now?
Well, if Israel were to lay down its arms, if Israel were to agree to a ceasefire, then I think, and indeed withdraw from the occupied territories, which they are illegally occupying. And, Hamas has said that it would accept, it wouldn't recognise Israel, but it has said that it would accept a situation where the country went back to the 1967 borders. That's what needs to happen. But Britain, what needs to be happening here, the British politicians need to be calling for an imposing, indeed, an arms embargo and no-fly zone over Gaza to protect the...
Thank you, Chris. We're going to have to leave it there just because we're running out of time. But thank you, Chris Williamson, former Labour MP there.
I think that's the first time I've heard Chris Williamson say that they should go back to the 1967 borders. I think that's remarkable, but perhaps more remarkable that he wouldn't call for Hamas to lay down its arms.
Well, of course.
That to me is quite shocking, really.
Well, he doesn't believe that they're terrorists. Made that very clear. Anyway, coming up, we'll be debating if our courts are always consistent. It follows a judge's decision not to punish 3 pro-Palestinian protesters found guilty of a terror offence for wearing pro-Hamas badges. You're watching Good Afternoon Britain on GB News.
I think the most exciting bit for me is talking to people.
People who I think are ignored often by the major news channels. We're going to give news they want to hear. There's a voice there that needs to be heard. I think there's a chance here for a diversity of opinion to be expressed, which you don't find elsewhere. It's really exciting.
We don't hold back. We're free to say how decisions that are taken here
affect us all around the country. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Patrick Christie's Tonight, weekdays from 9 p.m.
Former First Minister Nicola Sturgeon has made her much-anticipated appearance before the Scottish COVID inquiry today. It comes after allegations emerged that she deleted key pandemic WhatsApp messages, used the pandemic to push her own political agenda. But let's just cast our mind back, shall we, to August 2021, when Sturgeon was asked if she'd hand over all her WhatsApps to the inquiry. Here we go.
I think if you understand statutory public inquiries, you would know that even if I wasn't prepared to give that assurance, which for the avoidance of doubt I am, then I wouldn't have the ability. This will be a judge-led statutory public inquiry.
Which, for the avoidance of doubt, I am. OK. Well, you weren't, were you? But fast forward to today, and she was much less forthcoming.
WhatsApp messages between yourself and Mr Yusuf and Ms Lloyd were produced by you. Where did you get them?
They were provided to me through the Scottish Government.
But did you delete them?
Yes.
Did you consider yourself, against that background and your considerable ministerial experience, to be precisely the right First Minister for the job?
No, that's not how I would have thought of it at all. There's a large part of me wishes that I hadn't been.
All right, then. I'm joined now by Tory MP Lee Anderson. Lee, are those just crocodile tears?
Well, it looks like crocodile tears to me, Patrick. I mean, first we had the missing camper van. Nobody knows where that is. Now we've got this nonsense. We've got these burner phones, dodgy £5 phones from wherever they bought them from, WhatsApp messages going missing. It all looks a little bit dodgy to me. I mean, she's bleating on there, she's crying on screen. this is not cutting no ice. You know, it's crocodile tears. It makes you wonder what the SNPs are all about, Patrick. It looks... I mean, the people that have burner phones, let's be clear, people that have these dodgy phones where you can't trace them and disappearing WhatsApp messages, these are normally criminals, these are drug dealers, and you know what? These SNPs are no better than criminals.
Join us every night on GB News at 11 p.m. for Headliners, which is 3 top comedians going through the next day's news stories, which is exactly what you need, because when the establishment has gone crazy, you need some craziness to make sense of it.
Headliners. You don't have to bother reading the newspaper. We've got it covered for you. Every night at 11 p.m. and repeated every morning at 5 a.m. We won't send you to sleep like some of the other paper review shows out there.
So join us 11 p.m. every night on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Ooh, well, 3 women have been found guilty of terrorism offences after they displayed images of paragliders celebrating Hamas tactics.
The judge decided not to punish them and handed each of them a 12-month conditional discharge. I should say, not punish them with jail time, but they did hand down a 12-month conditional discharge.
Yes, but did this deserve tougher punishment? We're asking, do we have one rule for Palestine protesters and another for everyone else when it comes to how the law is applied?
Well, joining us now is the human rights lawyer Shoaib Khan and security expert at the University of Buckingham, Professor Anthony Glees. Thank you very much, both of you, for joining us. Professor Anthony Glees, let's start with you. Do you think there was an issue with how this judgment was handed down yesterday?
Yes, I do. It's clear to me that the law was broken, and if the law is broken, those who break it must be punished. And yes, they got a conditional discharge, but the way in which the judge delivered his judgment seemed to me to be totally inappropriate, because he excused what they had done in terms of the emotional times in which we're living. Justice is blind, literally. He should be blind with a blindfold. So whether these are emotional times or not, it's got nothing to do with it. These 3 women were glorifying Hamas terrorists. Whatever we may feel about the war being waged in Gaza, and I think most decent people are horrified at this war, at Netanyahu's war and his crackpot cabinet war, this is the United Kingdom, and we do not support terrorism in this country, despite what ex-Labour MP Chris Williamson was telling your listeners a few moments ago. We do not support this kind of behaviour, and indeed we stamp on it rightly in this country. So this was the glorification of terrorism, pure and simple. It was a radicalising move, and a slap on the wrist, if it was that, is absolutely unacceptable.
Well, Shoaib, let's bring you in, because the judge said that he didn't find any evidence that the women were in support of Hamas.
Yes, hi. I mean, I think generally just the idea, you know, what we've been talking about today, you know, if there is a two-tier system, is it, you know, favouring either ethnic minorities or pro-Palestinian protesters? I think that's quite laughable, quite ridiculous, really. You know, what we've had is ever since, you know, the October 7th attacks and the war after that, you know, the genocide, massacre, whatever you want to call it. What we've had is, you know, pro-Palestinian protesters constantly demonized, monstered by not just the media or other people, but, you know, the Home Secretary, the Prime Minister, everyone. You know, these are hate marches. We need to clamp down on them. So that's the level of fury being shown to pro-Palestinian people in the UK right now. Whereas when it was, you know, there was marches similarly in central London to express support for Israel, the previous Home Secretary was in fact herself there. So we can see the two-tier system, but I don't think it's definitely not in favor of pro-Palestinians. Secondly, then, in terms of the criminal justice system itself, I know lots of people are coming up with previous cases that this judge has sat on and his decisions there. But firstly, I mean, I think one thing, not just in this case, but generally, at least for me, I think we have to move ourselves or distance ourselves from the idea that jail is the only way of punishment. You know, just sending someone to prison is not the only punishment. If these young women, who I assume would have had clean records previously, if they're going to have a criminal record now, it's going to remain there forever. It's something they might have to declare and so on. It's been all over the media. And I think that is punishment enough for having a sticker on your jacket or on your clothes. So, I mean, I think it was the right decision. Obviously,
okay, let's throw that back. This is punishment enough.
No, I don't think it is punishment enough. I mean, I should have thought several months of community service and also attendance, perhaps, at some kind of Holocaust exhibition. Because these three women, the fact that they're young, again, in a way means nothing. Many jihadists are young. Many people will be inspired by what those three paragliding enthusiasts were showing. That's glorification. That is against the law of this country. Whether it's an emotional time or not is neither here nor there. And unless the law is upheld, those people who, like me, believe in law and order will feel that the justice system is not working. And Mr. Khan says, you know, call it genocide, call it... No, words are very important. One can absolutely be against the war that the Israeli government is waging in Gaza. One can be against it, but be equally against terrorism and those people who started this awful war in Gaza and the murder of over 1,000 perfectly innocent Israelis by Hamas terrorists in a carefully planned operation. So to glorify those who took part in this terrorist action is completely unacceptable. And, you know, we can see it tied the Labour Party up referring to Israel as a Zionist entity, as Chris Williamson did. These people are completely mad. Israel is a state, a sovereign state. You can criticize the government, you can criticize the prime minister, but Israel is not the same as Jews, just as Muslims are not the same as jihadists. People like me have always made this point. But the real problem is radicalization.
Yeah, that's a very important point to make. But Shoaib, just in terms of two-tier justice then, I think there is a concern that sometimes judges rule very harshly when it comes to, I don't know, offensive WhatsApp messages and the like. What's the point in having anti-terror legislation if it doesn't lead to punishment?
I mean, I'm glad you asked that question, but as I said, that's the thing. It is, you know, literally anti-terror laws gone mad. The point is, you know, having a sticker on a jacket makes you a terrorist. Not giving your PIN or password to the police makes you a terrorist. Literally, you know, anything against the law. I think that is actually, and, you know, lots of people have said that. I've spoken about it in the past. I think our anti-terror legislation has gone too far. And that's why it loses any effect. If these three women are essentially being called terrorists or guilty of a crime under counter-terror legislation, then, you know, what's the difference between them and any other actual terrorist? So I think, you know, I mean, I'm glad you asked that question, because I think our laws have gone too far. Literally anyone, you use the wrong language. And if you can be convicted under anti-terror laws, I think that's absurd, really. So that's one point to make. You know, even if we think, you know, they were inciting hatred or some other crime was being committed, it definitely wasn't terrorism. So I don't think they should have been charged under.
Well, the accusation, of course, is that they were celebrating terrorism, celebrating what happened on October the 7th. But there you go. Thank you very much for that head-to-head. Shoaib Khan, human rights lawyer, thank you for your time, and security expert at the University of Buckingham, Professor Anthony Glees. That was a good head-to-head.
It was a good head-to-head. I wish we had a couple more minutes there, to be honest. But no, thank you to both gentlemen for talking through those. We're going to be getting on further with the assessment of how things are shifting in this country. Is this very week the week that the polls began to turn? We'll be talking about the Labour Party's meltdown after your headlines.
Tom, thank you very much. These are your latest headlines at 1:33. The rate of inflation remains at 4%, the same as in December, despite forecasters predicting a rise. Figures from the Office for National Statistics found that food prices fell on a monthly basis for the first time since September 2021. Shadow Chancellor Rachel Reeves criticised the figure, saying Conservatives cannot fix the economy because they're the reason it is broken. The Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, has insisted the economy has turned a corner as he held his first Business Council meeting of the year. However, Chancellor Jeremy Hunt says more needs to be done.
Inflation never falls in a straight line, and although it's welcome that it hasn't gone up today, it is still double the target level of 2%, and we're not going to be able to relieve pressure on families until we hit that target and the Bank of England feels able to reduce interest rates. So this is a time to stick to a plan that is clearly working, but we need to make sure that we really get to that end point of inflation at 2%.
Pressures mounting for Sir Keir Starmer as a second Labour Party candidate has been suspended following accusations of anti-Semitism. Graham Jones allegedly suggested British people who volunteer to fight with Israel Defence Forces should be locked up. That comes a day after Labour withdrew support for the party's candidate for the Rochdale by-election, Azhar Ali, for suggesting Israel had taken the October 7th Hamas assault as a pretext to invade Gaza. Sir Keir Starmer yesterday vowed that his party has changed under his rule. And train drivers at 5 rail operators have voted to continue taking strike action for 6 months. ASLEF announced that its members on Chiltern, C2C, East Midlands, Northern and Transpennine railways had overwhelmingly backed carrying on with the strikes. Unions involved in pay disputes have to reballot their members every 6 months on continuing with such action. For the latest stories, you can sign up to GB News Alerts by scanning the QR code on your screen, or you can go to gbnews.com/alerts.
For a valuable legacy your family can own, gold coins will always shine bright. Rosalind Gold proudly sponsors the GB News Financial Report.
Here's a quick snapshot of today's markets. The pound will buy you $1.2566 and €1.1728. The price of gold is £1,584 and 4 pence per ounce, and the FTSE 100 is at 7,587 points.
Rosalind Gold proudly sponsors the GB News Financial Report.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
In the GB Newsroom, we bring you the news as it happens. With our team of dedicated journalists across the UK, we're ready to give you accurate reporting every day. When the news breaks, we'll be there with bulletins on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Patrick Christie's Tonight, weekdays from 9 p.m.
Ken, do you find the Union flag, the Union Jack, divisive?
In some situation, but as Simon quite clearly stated, and I agree with everything that he says in regards that there's situation when people use it for ulterior motive to cause fear, alarm and distress. We saw that with the far right when they came up to saying protecting the Churchill statues and things of that nature. But largely on the large whole, even I wave the St. George's flag on a sporting occasion. And I don't see anything wrong in raising the Union Jack or the St. George's flag so long as the intention is correct. And as he says, Mr. Brockhurst, he served for the country and he should have every right to be proud of what he's done and the way that he wants to display it.
All right, Simon, what do you make of this kind of, I would argue it as like student social media-based politics, where you get these pillocks from the Green Party or whatever saying, oh, it's divisive and I can't believe it. It will be legal in this country to do... Do those people need to get out more? I was on the streets of Stratford earlier on, an incredibly diverse place, speaking to a massive range of people right across different age demographics. I couldn't find a single sausage who said to me that they thought that this guy from the Green Party was right.
He obviously has absolutely no attention from anybody, and this is his way of finding attention. Both Ken and myself, we both agree that nobody should use any symbol of national identity to offend others deliberately, because that's just inflaming a situation. There's so much sensitivity around so many things today, and people do get offended by so much so quickly without any rhyme or reason.
GB News, unlike other broadcasters, isn't obsessed with the London-Westminster bubble. We think there's a nation beyond the M25, and that's why we talk about the issues that matter across the land. Join me on State of the Nation, 8 to 9 o'clock, Monday to Thursday, on GB News. Daisy's listening, and you should too.
Right, tonight it's coming up to 1:40. So shall we start with the Labour Party? Are they in a crisis? Joining us now is GB News senior political commentator Nigel Nelson and the former Chief of Staff to the Chancellor of the Exchequer, James Price. Lovely title there. James, shall we start with you? Of course, lots of accusations of anti-Semitism, Keir Starmer being accused of not acting swiftly enough. Do you think this will impact the polls?
Yeah, I think it will do. I think it's that little whiff that people think, well, maybe this guy Starmer's better. Most people don't pay that much attention to politics and kind of forget that Starmer was trying to put Corbyn into number 10 in 2017 and in 2019, going around saying Corbyn's great, Corbyn's great. And now he's making this big song and dance. We've changed. I'm decisive. I'm stamping all these people out. And people go, OK, good for you, you know. And then he's been talking about not just calling for a ceasefire in Israel, which is, I think, a very sensible thing to hold the line, and that's probably cost some support in some communities. And now this has come out, people go, oh, maybe the mask has slipped.
Nigel, is this the point that perhaps it's less about the detail? A lot of people aren't paying as close attention to politics as GB News viewers are and as we are. Most people probably don't watch political TV all the time. But they get this sense that this guy who seemed a bit sensible, might have even seemed strong and stable, has suddenly become a bit weak and wobbly.
Yeah, I mean, I think that what we need to see is next week's polls. I mean, the most recent one, which shows a drop of 7%, was over the weekend. So it's next week that this will kind of click in. And I think probably you're right, that the Labour Party is in crisis at the moment. That we spoke about this on Monday, and I think I was wrong when I said to you that he should have, that Starmer should have put the voters of the Labour voters in Rochdale first. I think that on reflection, the mistake was not acting immediately the moment you actually verified those comments were genuine, and he should have done that. There were other ways around it. He might have persuaded the candidate, if he became an MP, to resign immediately, hold a new by-election. That was a possibility. He could have said, right, we won't have this guy for the general election campaign. That was another. But actually, again, thinking about it, they don't really cut it. What you've got to do is that if you have zero tolerance, it's got to be across the board, and you should have acted immediately.
James, the Labour Party has a problem here, doesn't it? The way that Israel-Gaza, Israel-Palestine has blown up in the way it has and has become such a key issue for so many Labour voters. And whether they go to other parties, independents, who could, stand up to the Labour candidate.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is the problem. Starmer can be as disciplined as he likes on the current crop of Labour MPs, on the new candidates who are coming in. But the rot goes, I think, a lot deeper. So if you look at the Labour membership and you say some Labour voters, most Labour voters, just ordinary, normal, decent people. I'm sure most Labour Party members as well. But as you said, there's a big section of people now, quite a growing section, for whom the events happening in Israel and Palestine are the most important things and takes a massive priority over any economic or domestic or cultural or social affairs happening here in Britain. And why is that? And we've got to get to the point that this guy has a rally. Why did he say these things? It's either because he himself believes the horrible stuff that he was saying, or he knew that the Labour members in that room believed it and it would be useful, or, I suspect, probably both.
But frankly here, there's only a handful of seats where the vote or the section of the population that really does care more about Gaza than about the cost of living here at home. There's only a few seats where that could actually really affect things. Perhaps the bigger danger for the Labour Party here is a party that looks like it's talking to itself and fighting with itself, rather than a party that looks like it's caring about the issues that across the board people face. And are we, perhaps, Nigel, seeing a shift? The Labour Party could easily say, up until last week, the Tories are fighting like rats in a sack. They can't even govern themselves. Right. How could they govern the country? Well, now the Tories can say, right back at you.
Yeah, well, there is a bit of that. I mean, I do think this is actually a minority of people who are involved in this. I don't think this is across the entire Labour membership. And the problem Labour has got, and it's just been exacerbated by the war in Gaza, is that the opposition to Israel's refusal to get a two-state solution, often it tripped over into anti-Semitism. So, for instance, Jeremy Corbyn is not an anti-Semite, but the language he was using gave the green light to other people to say anti-Semitic things. What Jeremy Corbyn was arguing about was Israel as a state, not Jewish people.
James, you were wobbling your head there. Do you think Jeremy Corbyn's an anti-Semite?
I think more importantly than what I, as a non-Jewish person, thinks, as a lot of my Jewish friends before that 2017 and before that 2019 election, they'd been Labour Party members, they'd gone knocking on doors for people like Ed Miliband. They left the party and some of them were thinking about leaving the country if Corbyn were to win. I think that's more important, and I think that's the problem. And Tom, you mentioned about this idea that it's a small number of people that care about this stuff. I think what we're seeing is actually there's a lot more people for whom this is a really big deal than we think. Look at every Saturday, look at the hundreds of thousands of people marching and protesting, care much more about this than anything else. It's a scary feeling for me that this stuff is only going to grow in importance. And if we start seeing the politicisation of people based on old ethnic lines or religious lines and things like that in British secular politics, that's a really scary place. And I'm not sure that's where we want to go by any means.
Definitely. And it's also very concerning for a lot of Labour MPs, particularly those standing in the shadow cabinet. Angela Rayner, clip after clip of her being hounded, aggressively protested against over Labour Party's position on Israel-Gaza.
Yeah, I mean,
intimidating.
Oliver Tobias on the other side, as an example there. No, I mean, that kind of behaviour is not acceptable.
But it's happening.
I agree, it is happening, but I mean, these are people protesting against them rather than something that you can actually blame them for.
I'm not sure about that. Again, a couple of years ago, someone like John McDonnell, who was Corbyn's best mate, he was the Shadow Chancellor, he's the one that said...
Still a Labour MP.
Still a Labour MP.
Not suspended. Corbyn suspended, not John McDonnell.
I'm not sure I'm allowed at this time of day to say some of the stuff that he said about Conservative Party cabinet member Esther McVeigh. It was lynched and then a very rude word, and he encouraged all of that. And they said that every Tory out there, because of the evil things they were doing, they should be harassed in the street, we should never let any of them go. All that kind of stuff. That has been stoked up by Labour politicians for a long time. And now they can rightly see how horrible
just by John McDonnell. I mean, that was a phrase, he did regret it, and he shouldn't have said it.
Did he regret it, or did he regret getting caught out for saying it?
He shouldn't have said it. Yeah. I mean, quite clearly, it's an appalling thing to say.
Well, what we can't do is I think there is a worry that the mob may dictate policy further down the line. But thank you very much, Nigel and James. Coming up, how Met police officers threatened to arrest gospel preachers singing outside a church. Believe it or not, you're watching Good Afternoon Britain.
Wake up to the headlines with Headliners every morning at 5 a.m. We treat you to the day's biggest stories before anyone else, 7 days a week. You can catch up on everything you need to know before you've even had your kippers. Headliners every morning at 5 a.m, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Good afternoon, Britain.
Good afternoon, Britain. Join us, Tom and Emily,
to find out what's happening in the heart of Westminster
and why it matters to you.
Weekdays from midday, we bring you the most compelling stories from across the United Kingdom.
And from your doorstep to our inbox.
That's right, we want to hear from you.
GB News,
Britain's news channel.
Martin Daubney, weekdays from 3 p.m.
You have a president in President Biden who's not enforcing the law that was passed by Congress. President Obama, criticize him or not, actually enforced the law and was deporting people that had crossed illegally. Of course, President Trump enforced the law and improved the law to make sure that and worked with Mexico to have the Remain in Mexico policy. Biden has abandoned federal policy. In fact, he's deliberately trying to let in as many immigrants as possible. More for the Democrats, more is better and less is racist.
Just astonishing. And the statement that Greg Abbott put out is really feisty stuff. He said the federal government has broken the contract between the United States and the state of Texas. And the eye numbers, Greg, are simply eye-watering. 6 million illegal immigrants have crossed our southern border in just 3 years, Governor Abbott says. That's more than the population of 33 states in the United States. Astonishing numbers.
And Martin, that's just Texas. If you add Arizona and other border states, you know, it's pushing 10 million. By the end of Biden's term, it'll be 11 million. A study by Yale University a few weeks ago, 3 very liberal professors that did the study estimate there's 22 million illegal aliens. So this is a crisis that was created by Biden. It's what he wants. They want unfettered access to the border. They're letting them in. It's a real hardship on the working people of Texas and other border states. And now it's a real hardship on cities that the federal government, as well as the governors of Texas and other states, are sending some of the migrants to those so-called sanctuary cities.
every Sunday from 11. Join Michael Portillo.
There will be topical discussion, looking at the week before and the week to come. So kick back and relax at 11 a.m. on Sundays on GB News with me, Michael Portillo. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Good afternoon, Britain. It's coming up to 10 minutes to 2, and the Metropolitan Police have been filmed threatening to arrest yet another Christian preacher over what were called hate crime complaints just weeks after a gospel singer faced similar warnings for singing biblical songs. So we're back again with the panel. GB News senior political commentator Nigel Nelson and the former Chief of Staff to the Chancellor of the Exchequer, James Price. James, these stories are pretty baffling to most people.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, but maybe we're looking at this the wrong way around, right? We've seen in recent weeks stories that lots of these asylum seekers and illegal migrants who are coming over on small boats and the rest of it, they're having miraculous conversions to Christianity, and now they're being immediately stopped from singing outside. Perhaps that's what it is, but no.
On the one hand, the state's saying you should all become Christian. On the other hand, it's saying, no, you can't practice your Christianity.
No, but this is a clear infringement of some kind of religious liberty. We don't want to go back to wars we've had hundreds of years ago around religious toleration. We talked about that, religious elements of conflicts that are happening around the world now as well. And it just feels that the prevalence of religion in public life has massively receded to a point where, in COVID, churches were closed, right? And that is a fundamental part of people's lives. If you think, you're not going to go to heaven or something if you don't get to go to church, and now you're being told you can't preach and practice in certain ways.
But the singer on the street, wasn't it? I mean, it turned out, I think, that the police officer was misunderstood in her interpretation of the law, but she was thinking, there's no busking allowed on this street, so we're going to stop anyone from singing. Can these things sometimes be egged up a bit?
Yeah, let's hope that that's the case. But again, I think the point is, we look at COVID, churches were shut as if they were just like going to the cinema or something, as if it's non-essential to worship your Lord and Saviour, if that's who you think it is. And I think that as we've moved to a more secular society in general, people haven't gone the Richard Dawkins way of just being all enlightened and wonderful. They've taken up new religions, and I think in lots of cases, terrible ones. Look at the way that people are gluing themselves to streets. Look at the way that Greta Thunberg thinks the world is about to end, right? Those are religious fanatics, are just of different new religions that haven't had the test of time and have the benefits that maybe Christianity does.
Nigel, people will look at stories like this of the Met Police getting involved with a few gospel singers on the street and think that, Christianity is being attacked here.
Yeah, well, hang on. The gospel singer thing was absolutely appalling. That shouldn't have happened. This one's a completely different case. The whole point here is that there was a complaint about homophobia, and I'm sure the police involved weren't actually master theologians or anything like that. But the point was that they were attacking homosexuals from a piece of the Bible which doesn't actually exist. So there is an element where the police were going in quite rightly.
Because this is about not just what is said, but where it's said and how it said it.
Well, yeah, I mean, I actually looked up this section of the Bible they quoted, and I can't find it. I mean, I can see the bit where it's coming from, so I don't know what sort of Bible they're reading, but the actual section is talking about evildoers and unbelievers. They've thrown in homosexuals, drunks, liars and prostitutes on the evildoers bit. So if there was then a complaint about homophobia, on the face of it, that is actually a reasonable complaint. The police then go and talk to them and no further action is taken.
So being grossly offensive on the streets of England?
Well, actually, I mean, technically breaking the law.
Well, there you go.
If they were marching in favour of Palestine on a Saturday, it would be absolutely fine, though, right?
Well,
this is the double standard that is underlying a lot of this.
If they don't break the law, yeah.
But I suppose this is actually perhaps at the nub of it, right? One or two people standing preaching, being a bit odd and whatever, the police feel like they can go up to those because it's sort of like a manageable situation. If you have a big crowd of people, the police go, oof, might not bother with that, even if they might be breaching the same law.
Well, hang on, but if you're dealing with a protest, which is a completely different thing, with thousands of people involved, what the police have got to do is work out what is best in the public interest and for public safety. If they take an action that's going to cause a riot, then it would be quite quite right not to do that. So, in a sense, there are different kind of ways of doing things for different kind of situations. I think that's right. That's the operational independence of the police to decide.
Well, let's not pretend they always get it right.
No, of course they don't get it right. I mean, no one gets everything right. But I mean, certainly they should arrest people when they are breaking the law. That seems to be absolutely right. What they shouldn't do is, if that arrest leads to a riot, they might think twice, and that's what you're going to give the police the chance to do.
Sorry, we're going to have to leave it there, but we'll come back to you in a little bit. Nigel Nelson and James Price. Coming up, we'll be joined by a pollster as Labour's approval ratings drop significantly. See you very shortly indeed. Stay with us.
A brighter outlook with Box Solar, sponsors of weather on GB News.
Hello there, welcome to your latest GB News weather update with me, Annie, from the Met Office. There'll be further outbreaks of rain for many of us through the rest of the day, and it's going to be a very cloudy but an exceptionally mild few days. That's as we've got this very mild air pushing up from the south, spreading across the country, but the far north of Scotland will still be holding on to that colder air for the time being, and there will be the best of the sunshine across the far north of Scotland through the rest of the day as well. However, elsewhere, there'll be a lot of cloud around. Outbreaks of rain mainly across parts of Northern Ireland, central southern Scotland, northern England too, as well as the south coast, where we could see some quite heavy bursts. But elsewhere, where we don't see the rain, there's still going to be quite a lot of cloud around, but it will be feeling very mild through the evening and overnight as well. We'll see another band of rain push in from the southwest through the course of the night. Ahead of that, in the far north of Scotland, could get down to 1 or 2 degrees, so a chillier start to the evening. But elsewhere, across many areas of the UK, it'll be another cloudy, mild and damp night. So it could be a bit of a murky start tomorrow. There's a lot of low cloud around for the next few days, but we'll see the worst of the rain through Thursday pushing in from the west this time. So eastern areas will probably get away with a largely dry day. And if we do start to see any breaks in the cloud, any sunny spells coming through, temperatures could climb as high as 16, possibly 17 degrees, which is exceptionally mild for the time of year. But further west, there is a risk of some localised flooding. See you later.
That warm feeling inside from Boxed Boilers, sponsors of weather on GB News.
I'm Christopher Hope.
And I'm Gloria Di Piero, bringing you
PMQ's Live here on GB News. Every Wednesday, we'll bring you live coverage of Prime Minister's questions when Rishi Sunak and Sir Keir Starmer go head-to-head in the House of Commons.
We'll be asking our viewers and listeners to submit the questions that they would like to put to the Prime Minister, and we'll put that to our panel of top politicians in our Westminster studio.
That's PMQ's Live here on GB News, Britain's election channel.
Farage, Monday to Thursday from 7 p.m.
Lots of people have different ideas, but principally a conservative approach to getting growth is to reduce taxes so that people, ordinary people and businesses can spend more of their own money to invest and grow the economy.
So the theory is that you cut taxes and that then pumps more money into the economy.
Exactly right. And then people, it's not government that are creating wealth. It's individuals, businessmen, companies that create wealth. It's the private sector that creates wealth, that the public sector then taxes and spends.
I get the theory, but one of the criticisms of you, and I think one of the criticisms actually of all political parties, is they appear to be incapable of cutting government spending.
That's the key. I mean, and I think when I look back, is that we should have had a credible plan to reduce the increase in spending. Now, that's often a difficult concept to explain.
But it's in line with inflation, etc.
That's all right. So when you're slowing the increase, it means, one year you spend £100 and the next year you spend maybe £101 as opposed to going up to £110. So the actual level isn't going down, but you're slowing the increase. And that's very much what I tried to do. And actually, looking back, the one thing I wish I'd done, was to present a credible spending plan at the same time as the tax cuts that we announced.
You had a go, it didn't work out for whatever reason, and that analysis will go on for some years to come. We have Jeremy Hunt there as Chancellor now, hinting quite strongly now there won't be any tax cuts, but the truth of it is, under 14 years of Conservatives, for a variety of reasons, the tax burden has risen.
That's right.
To the highest since the Attlee government, way back in
80 years,
1951, whatever
right.
it is.
2024, a battleground year.
The year the nation decides.
As the parties gear up their campaigns for the next general election.
Who will be left standing when the British people make one of the biggest decisions of their lives?
Who will rise?
And who will fall? Let's find out together.
For every moment, the highs, the lows, the twists and turns.
We'll be with you for every step of this journey.
In 2024, GB News is Britain's election channel.
Good afternoon, Britain. It's 2 p.m. on Wednesday, the 14th of February.
It is, and Labour meltdown. With the party's polling lead tumbling, have Labour's series of catastrophic U-turns begun to catch up with them? Keir Starmer insists his party has changed, but now faces calls to investigate 5 more candidates. All of this ahead of 2 crucial by-elections tomorrow.
It's revealed the Home Office has bought thousands of properties for asylum seekers despite Britain's acute housing shortage. The government, which refuses to significantly relax planning regulations, pledged to prioritise British homes for British workers. So is it saying one thing but doing another?
And Inflation Nation, UK's inflation rate remains unchanged, with food prices coming down. The Chancellor insists the government's plan is working. But how will it play out with voters? We'll be joined by a polling expert.
Here's something we literally haven't mentioned all show, and yet, had it been 0.1% different, we'd probably be talking about it the whole time. Inflation is flat. 4%, same as it was before. Everyone was expecting it to go up. And do you know what? If the sort of people who measured it were just slightly, ever so slightly out, and it had gone up by 0.01% or 0.1% or whatever it was, everyone would be running with it. You'd see it on the headlines. You'd see it on other news networks. But the fact that it stayed the same means everyone forgets.
But it is quite interesting, because what will the Bank of England do next? What are they going to do with interest rates? Are they just going to hold them, keep them as they are for a little bit longer, see what's happening with the inflation rates, or are they going to perhaps even drop them?
Well, you know, our very own Liam Halligan always says the next move will be down, but it does show a little sign of recovery in the British economy. Perhaps we're going to see inflation fall further. Perhaps we're going to see interest rates come down. All of this, as Labour's U-turning on many different issues, it points to things that potentially we could be seeing the doldrums of the Tory polling, perhaps in their final weeks.
Yeah, one economic expert said that we risk actually deflation.
Oh, that's not good either.
Along with a recession. So hopefully he's wrong on that. But let us know how it's
I was trying to sell a positive message, Emily. You've ruined it.
Well, there's always, you know, trade-offs. Let's call them. GBnews at gbnews.com. Let us know what's on your mind. But first, your headlines.
Emily, thank you very much. Your top stories from the GB newsroom. We start with some breaking news from the last 15 minutes. Train drivers on Northern and LNER will walk out on March the 1st and ban overtime for 3 days in a separate row to the national pay dispute. Meanwhile, train drivers at 5 railway operators have voted to continue taking strike action for 6 months. ASLEF announced that its members on Chiltern, C2C, East Midlands, Northern and TransPennine Railways had overwhelmingly backed carrying on with the action. Unions involved in pay disputes have to reballot their members every 6 months on continuing with industrial action. The rate of inflation remains at 4%, the same as in December, despite forecasters predicting a rise. Figures from the Office for National Statistics found that food prices fell on a monthly basis for the first time since September 2021. Shadow Chancellor Rachel Reeves criticised the figures, saying Conservatives cannot fix the economy because they are the reason it's broken. The Prime Minister has insisted the economy has turned a corner as he held his first Business Council meeting of the year. However, Chancellor Jeremy Hunt says more needs to be done.
Inflation never falls in a straight line, and although it's welcome that it hasn't gone up today, it is still double the target level of 2%, and we're not going to be able to relieve pressure on families until we hit that target and the Bank of England feels able to reduce interest rates. So this is a time to stick to a plan that is clearly working, but we need to make sure that we really get to that end point of inflation at 2%.
Pressures mounting for Sir Keir Starmer as a second Labour Party candidate has been suspended following accusations of anti-Semitism. Graham Jones allegedly suggested British people who volunteer to fight with Israel Defence Forces should be locked up. That comes a day after Labour withdrew support for the party's candidate for the Rochdale by-election, Azhar Ali, for suggesting Israel had taken the October 7th Hamas assault as a pretext to invade Gaza. Sir Keir vowed yesterday that his party has changed under his rule. A London theatre has banned a comedian from performing after Jewish audience members were reportedly hounded out of a show. Paul Curry presented both the Ukrainian and Palestinian flag to the audience during his show. He's been accused of encouraging the crowd to chant and shout at Israeli ticket holder Liav Eitan after he refused to stand and applaud the Palestinian flag. Soho Theatre in central London has apologised and says it's looking into the incident. There are reports his next show could be cancelled. Mr. Eaton told GB News he'd felt excluded.
In the last 5 minutes of his show, since he produced those two flags, I was taken immediately out of the show. In my head, I was...
You felt excluded?
Yeah, excluded, and just in my mind, I was just thinking about how unfair this comparison is. I just really didn't agree with that statement.
18 out of 31 NATO countries, according to its chief, are on track to meet the 2% military spending target. Jens Stoltenberg was speaking at a conference where he says overall spending is set for another record year. That's as Russia's full-fledged war against Ukraine enters its third year. He also says NATO's European states will invest a combined total of around £302 billion in defence this year. The comments come as British troops departed Southampton just yesterday, headed for Poland to take part in the largest NATO exercise since the Cold War. That's to demonstrate the alliance's capabilities. An inquest has been told that a man in South London was shot in the neck and chest by armed police. Convicted stalker Bryce Hodgson was shot dead on January 30th after he broke into a home in Surrey Quays. The inquest also heard Hodgson had gained entrance to the property armed with a crossbow and other weapons. And I'm sorry to have to tell you this, for those planning a romantic night in and ordering a takeaway for Valentine's Day today, you might need to rethink those plans. Deliveroo and Uber Eats food deliveries are set to be hit by a huge strike in the UK. Thousands of its drivers will be walking out later today between 5 and 10 p.m. Delivery Job UK, an umbrella representation of the gig economy workers, has arranged that strike to demand better pay and working conditions for workers. For all of the latest stories, you can sign up to GB News Alerts by scanning the QR code on your screen, or you can go to gbnews.com/alerts. Now back to Tom and Emily.
Good afternoon, Britain. It's 7 minutes past 2, and the Labour Party is in turmoil today as Sir Keir Starmer is forced to drop a second parliamentary candidate due to alleged anti-Semitic comments.
Yes, the party is being pressured to investigate 5 more. That's according to The Telegraph this morning.
Graham Jones is said to have used an expletive to refer to Israel, effing Israel, and said British people who fight in their defence forces should be locked up.
Well, joining us now in the studio is Head of Digital at the Jewish Chronicle, Josh Kaplan. Now, Josh, we hear a lot about how criticism of Israel, criticism of Zionism doesn't mean anti-Semitism. Where can we draw that line?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an interesting question, right? And I think that was always the defence during the Corbyn years of a lot of Labour people that were accused of anti-Semitism, is that it's not anti-Semitism, we're just criticising Israel. I think for me at least, it tends to go over into the line is that when you have a disproportionate focus on Israel because it's a Jewish state, and when you hold Israel to a much higher standard than you do any other countries, again, you know, a lot of these people that have said things about Israel in the wake of October 7th, they're not, you know, legitimate critics of Israeli government policy. They weren't involved in the judicial reform protests last year. They weren't actually involved in the sort of machinations of Israeli policy. They're just criticising it because of their overstated interest in the conflict.
Yeah, it must be said that there are lots of people who have been very critical of the current Israeli government, who no one says are anti-Semitic in any way, shape or form. But Josh, why does this seem to be a particular problem with parties on the left? Of course, there is anti-Semitism on the right, but with parties on the left, there does seem to be this sort of persistent problem.
I think it all comes down to the fact that for left-wing people in this country and across the world, Israel is an issue that cannot be dealt with rationally. You know, it has to be talked about in these hyperbolic terms. It has to be talked about in terms of genocide and ethnic cleansing and all these sort of really nasty, over-the-top, exaggerated terms that you just don't see with any other conflict. And I think that kind of brain rot, if you will, over Israel leads people down this path where, because they hate Israel so much, it leads them to conflate Israel and Jewish people, and then Jewish people end up being the targets of their sort of anger.
Yes, because earlier in the show we spoke to a former Labour MP who believes that Hamas are resistance
freedom fighters.
Yeah, I mean, look, one man's terrorist, another man's freedom fighter. I think, to be clear, any group that kills innocent people should be regarded as terrorists and not, you know, lauded in polite society.
Do you think what this candidate said about people going, Jewish people in this country going off to fight with the IDF forces, do you think that is, just saying that, do you believe that's anti-Semitic?
It's a tough one. I mean, you know, my sister fought in the IDF. She's a British citizen. I think what the insinuation is that if you go and fight for Israel, then you're less loyal to the UK than if you're anywhere else. And that's an accusation that's been levelled against Jews for centuries, and it only seems to be levelled against Jewish people. So, yeah, I would say it verges on anti-Semitic.
And I think the real concern here is that there were so many things said at this meeting. No doubt we're going to hear more stories from this meeting as the days and weeks go on. But no one sort of thought to challenge it. And I think this is probably quite common in British society. People sitting in a room almost feel comfortable talking about Jewish people or the state of Israel in a way that they talk about no other state on the face of the earth or no other ethnicity.
Yeah, exactly. And I think the most interesting thing and the most sort of scary thing about this is that you're right, no one said anything during the meeting. And, you know, until yesterday, Keir Starmer was happy to stand by this person. And I think that was really, really worrying because, you know, if it had been any other race, any other country, it probably would have been immediate suspension, right?
And just lastly, we spoke to a professor, I think it was last week, who, well, in my view, indulged in a conspiracy theory, but seemed to believe that because Jewish people have been successful in some areas of our society, including in good jobs, essentially, have done well in this country, that therefore they can't be victims of discrimination.
I think that's, like, plainly ridiculous, right? I mean, you know, just because a group of people in a society does well doesn't mean that they can't suffer, you know, horrendous consequences as a result of prejudice. You know, it doesn't matter if someone has a good job, they can still be shouted at in the street, right? They can still be made to feel uncomfortable in the places they live, and no one's safe from that, you know, regardless of how good your job is or how much money you have in the bank account.
What was particularly chilling about that for me is this is exactly what they said in the 1930s. These people, they're so successful, they're taking all this from us, they're the reason why things aren't going well. No, it's ancient tropes. But Josh, thank you so much for coming in and talking to us about that.
Josh Kaplan from the Jewish Chronicle. Now, brand new polling from Savanta shows that Labour's approval ratings have dropped by 7 points, putting them just 12 points ahead of the Conservatives.
Yeah, it looks like a big blow for Keir Starmer ahead of some key by-elections this week and in a couple of weeks' time. But let's speak to the man behind these new figures, the political research director at Savanta, Chris Hopkins. Now, Chris, I suppose a big health warning needs to be put in these figures. This was research that was done over the weekend, so before these two candidates have been dropped by the Labour Party.
Yeah, that's absolutely right, Tom. The fieldwork began on Friday, concluded on Sunday. So, yeah, as you say, it was over the weekend and before this story really develops. I mean, I think it was rumbling along before that, but I think that it's far too early to tell whether any of this has had any impact on these figures. I think any poll that shows such a movement like this has to come with a bit of a pinch of salt, and I think that it's far too early to tell whether this is the start, perhaps, of a trend, or whether this is just an outlier. And we'll definitely be looking at our next poll that we'll release next week, but also others that are going to be conducted by other firms over the weekend to see whether this is perhaps the start of some movement away from Labour, or is just ending up as an outlier.
Did you ask any other questions alongside this polling?
So this one was just voting intention, was just how people would vote if an election was tomorrow. It's our standard question, the one that we do ask every week.
Chris, what do you think is the big driver of this? Because this was, of course, the week of the £28 billion U-turn, but you also said that this story had just started to get going. It seems like there is this beginning of a sense that perhaps Sir Keir Starmer isn't the strong, stable, competent leader that he's been projecting. How likely is it that if that narrative of a competent opposition, of someone who is strong and stable, starts to turn into someone who is weak and wobbly?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think what we've seen over the last couple of years, in fact, is that even when there have been some slight controversies around the Labour Party, or they've been asked difficult questions, say even perhaps when the Israel-Palestine conflict began, that has been silenced or at least diluted a little bit by also stories surrounding the government and their perceived lack of competence, particularly, especially over the last couple of years through Partygate and through the government of Liz Truss. I think Labour have been able to ride those a little bit better. I think what we've seen over the last fortnight is a pretty quiet news agenda in terms of the government. They haven't really put a foot out of place for the last fortnight, and Labour have managed to end up filling those airwaves with, yes, a story about U-turns, a story about them reneging on green pledges, and also rumblings of anti-Semitism still within the party. And I think that although those in isolation probably wouldn't cut through in a huge way to the electorate, when the clips that the average voter is seeing are about the Labour Party's perceived lack of competence, or at least them struggling to make clear decisions, and there being a lack of clarity over what they completely stand for, I think all that does is reinforces some of the doubts that voters do still have about the Labour Party and about Keir Starmer. And we've seen over the last couple of years that, yes, a lot of Conservative 2019 voters are willing to switch to the Labour Party, but that was always felt like a vote against the Conservatives rather than a vote for Labour. And if the Labour Party haven't perhaps changed quite in the way that Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves are saying that they have, then maybe those voters would start to go back.
Yes, thank you very much indeed, Chris Hopkins, Political Research Director at Savanta. Perhaps it also shows that a lot of people aren't, 100% sure yet.
Yeah, it seems that the Labour Party's been winning by default, by, huge margins. Today we see that perhaps that support is very, very broad, but potentially quite shallow. And we saw in 2017 how quickly things can shift. Really interesting week in politics.
Well, exactly. But inflation has remained unchanged at 4% in January, as food prices fall for the first time in 3 years, beating expectations from some of the more gloomy forecasters.
Yeah, here's what the Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt, had to say.
Inflation never falls in a straight line, and although it's welcome that it hasn't gone up today, it is still double the target level of 2%, and we're not going to be able to relieve pressure on families until we hit that target and the Bank of England feels able to reduce interest rates. So this is a time to stick to a plan that is clearly working, but we need to make sure that we really get to that end point of inflation at 2%.
Well, there you go, reminding us that it is still above the target of 2%, but stable at 4%. Let's discuss this more with our business and economics editor, Liam Halligan. And Liam, this is a bit of good news, better than expected.
Well, I think the Tories have done a good job of expectations management. Jeremy Hunt's been saying inflation doesn't fall in a straight line every day for the last fortnight. And so now people are saying, oh, inflation didn't go up. That's quite good. When actually, of course, everybody wants it to come down because it is still double the Bank of England's 2% target. It is on a downward trajectory. Fair play to the Chancellor. It is on a downward trajectory. Back in October 2022, inflation incredibly, was 11.1%, a 40-year high. It's now 4%, but it still is too high. Let's have a look at some of the details here on a little on-the-money graphic. It wouldn't be the same without one. So there you see January 2023, 4%. That means prices on average were 4% higher in January than they were in January 2023. That's what annual inflation means. Higher gas and electricity prices, there's what's keeping inflation high. The Ofgem energy price cap went up at the beginning of April. That's the kind of regulated prices that the energy companies are allowed to charge. Now, you said in the intro, you've got to be a little bit careful here, that food inflation went down. Actually, on an annual basis, food inflation is up. So food prices in January were on average 7% higher than in January 2023. So food price inflation is actually higher than general inflation. It's pushing up the overall number. What is true is that food prices in January were lower than they were just in December, but they're still higher than they were in January 2023. Do keep up. Transport inflation. What's negative inflation mean? Minus 0.5%. Well, that means going down. Prices actually coming down across the transport sector because, as any van driver will tell you, any professional driver will tell you, while petrol and diesel, my American proclivities coming in there, while petrol and diesel are still eye-wateringly expensive, they are down on this time last year. So the annual impact is that energy for cars, energy for transport is actually less expensive, so transport has actually come down. Look, this doesn't mean that the Bank of England is going to lower interest rates anytime soon. I don't think they can lower interest rates when inflation isn't falling. We're not going to get an interest rate cut on the 21st of March when the Monetary Policy Committee next meets. I do think by then the Federal Reserve could have cut interest rates, and then the Bank of England, all their modelling, all Andrew Bailey posturing about science and all ONS, where's my data, it'll all completely go out the window. And we have to lower rates because the Americans have lowered rates and we don't... Lots and lots of politics. So I do think that was a scientific analysis, by the way. I do think interest rates will come down in April or May. And look, tomorrow's really interesting. I know you guys are big into politics, as am I, but what an incredible thing. As voters go to the polls in Kingswood and in Wellingborough at 7 a.m, the ONS is going to release the GDP numbers, which may show, I'm predicting in my Telegraph column last weekend, they will show the UK went into recession at the back end of last year for the first time outside of the pandemic since 2009.
Liam...
Tom was in the Cubs in 2009.
Liam, just a quick one.
Were you in the Cubs?
I was in the Scouts.
If prices have are only 4% higher than they were this time last year...
Yeah, on average.
Then haven't wages increased by more than that?
Absolutely.
So we're actually sitting a lot prettier than we were.
We are to a degree if you get the average wage rise. The problem is that average wage rise, 6.2%, as it was said yesterday, down from 6.9%, still, as you've rightly spotted, ahead of inflation. So they're real terms wage increases. But those real terms wage average increases are massively skewed by the fat cats and TV presenters getting massive wage rises.
So City of London...
It's partly that. A lot of people would love an average wage rise, but they've never had an average wage rise. They've barely had wage rises. So it's what statisticians like me call the tyranny of average analysis. We've got to be careful here. On average, yes, real wages are ahead of inflation. On average, that's good because living standards are going up. But that means interest rates are less likely to fall anytime soon, which hammers you if you've got a mortgage or personal loans. And we must always remember that average experience is not everybody's average. A lot of people out there are not getting any wage rises despite massive inflation. And inflation is particularly heavy when it comes to food and energy, as my numbers showed, and the less well-off people, less likely to get wage rises, spend on those necessities disproportionately heavily. That's why inflation is so insidious, a tax above all on the poor.
A very mixed picture there.
Yeah, thank you very, very much for bringing us that detail. Now, in our discussion about all of this polling, we have, of course, mentioned that Rochdale by-election. So here are your candidates standing at the Rochdale by-election. Azir Ali is an independent. Mark Coleman, of course, he was the former Labour Party candidate and will appear as the Labour Party candidate on the ballot. Mark Coleman, independent. Simon Danchuk, Reform UK. Ian Donaldson, Liberal Democrat. Paul Ellison, Conservative.
George Galloway, Workers' Party of Britain, Michael Howarth, Independent, William Howarth, Independent, Guy Otten, Green Party, Ravin Rodent, Subordinate, Official Monster, Raving Loony, and David Tully, Independent.
There we go. Well, still to come, Harry and Meghan are in Canada. What are they doing there, and how did they fly that? Do I hear a private jet? I think I hear a private jet. All that to come after this.
GB News, unlike other broadcasters, isn't obsessed with the London-Westminster bubble. We think there's a nation beyond the M25, and that's why we talk about the issues that matter across the land. Join me on State of the Nation, 8 to 9 o'clock, Monday to Thursday, on GB News. Daisy's listening, and you should too.
Now then, Lee Anderson here. Join me on GB News on my show, The Real World, every Friday at 7 p.m.
I'm not eating bloody cat. Are you
Delicious.
mental?
Put in your mouth. OK, here comes a train.
Reminds me of the scene in Singing in the Rain.
Adam, is that a good one?
Whoa! Join me at 7 on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Britain's newsroom, weekday mornings from 9:30.
Are you across this microaggression story?
I'm across microaggressions. I'm also across XL bullies.
You would not last 5 minutes.
Oh, for God's
So
sake,
basic-
civil servants, give me strength.
So civil servants have been taught not to roll their eyes. Something you do very well. We both do it quite a lot, actually.
Because it's seen as an act of microaggression. This, by the way, this costs the taxpayer, this training, £160,000. What the hell is going on in our woke civil service? Who cares if someone rolls their eyes in exasperation?
What the hell is going on in our civil service, full stop, if the way that civil servants are communicating with each other is rolling their eyes and looking at their phones? I mean, is the government being run by people who are essentially acting to each other like stroppy teenagers?
Yeah.
But I'm all right with people, because, you see, I would be in defence of eye rolling.
So me too, I couldn't care less.
But do you know why? Because I want people to give me their genuine reaction, as long as it's not deeply offensive. But I want to know how people feel. And what they're being told here, civil servants are being taught, and of course this is an area of employment law, because people are taking cases against their bosses who roll their eyes at them. They're saying they're being encouraged to say nothing and nod their heads to promote transparency and inclusion. Don't show what you really think, just nod your head.
But I think that comes with then saying what you really think, and this is the key problem, and what these courses are trying to establish. And I looked into some of them when I was researching this, and it's not saying hide what you're feeling. It's saying, rather than huffing and puffing and rolling your eyes, if you've got a disagreement with someone, say I've got a disagreement with someone. Because otherwise, you can't have an effective workplace if people are sort of just passively, aggressively huffing at each other.
Why do these civil servants need to be taught this? Why do people need to be taught this? This is just normal discourse in a normal working day. You don't need a seminar on it.
Good afternoon, Britain.
Good afternoon, Britain. Join us, Tom and Emily,
To find out what's happening in the heart of Westminster.
and why it matters to you.
Weekdays from midday, we bring you the most compelling stories from across the United Kingdom.
And from your doorstep to our inbox.
That's right, we want to hear from you.
GB News,
Britain's news channel.
Well, it's 2:26 and the King has arrived back in London following the completion of treatment in Sandringham as the Duke and Duchess of Sussex land in Canada to help promote next year's Invictus Games.
Yeah, it's been reporting that the couple did not consult the royals before they launched their revamped website on Monday, which comes as Meghan bags a new podcast deal.
Yes, the Spotify one was rather short-lived, but joining us now in the studio is GB News royal correspondent Cameron Walker. Cameron, bring us up to date.
Yeah, well, actually, we have had a statement from Meghan, Duchess of Sussex, very subtle statement in the last hour or so. If you remember, we've talked at length now about the criticism of this new Sussex.com website. The accusation is that they are capitalising Harry and Meghan on their royal connections. Well, Meghan has subtly hit back by writing a statement about the website's designer, which is made by Article.com. She says, "There is a reason I have worked with Ryan and the talented team at Article for a decade. Their attention to detail, their creativity and care, and the thoughtful approach to design, as well as to the user experience. They're not just designers, they are collaborators who elevate your ideas into visual identities. They're a very special company, plus they're Canadian, so I'm a fan." Of course, Meghan spent many years in Canada filming the TV drama Suits. That website designer also designed her blog The Tig. If you remember, it was her lifestyle blog she had before she married Prince Harry. So clearly Meghan, despite the criticism, is incredibly pleased and happy with a very glossy website.
Elevate your ideas into visual identities.
Yeah, don't ask me to understand exactly what she means by that, but I think what she's getting at is, of course, what we've been talking about for the last few days. It's the rebrand, isn't it? It's the glossy image of this power couple of Harry and Meghan as they would like to be seen and being influencers on the global celebrity A-lister Hollywood circuit, while, as they say, wanting to do good and philanthropic work as well. But the question is it going to work? We've got, very commendably, we've got the Invictus Games over the next 3 days, or the countdown, 1 year countdown to the Invictus Games in Canada. But a lot of commentators are asking today, what have they actually done since leaving the royal family, which has made a positive difference to people's lives? In Meghan's biography, within this website, it talks about the cookbook she created with the Grenfell Tower victims. It also talks about some other philanthropic work that she's done. But all of that was done when she was still a working member of the royal family. And then, of course, we've got Spare and Prince Harry's book, and indeed the Netflix series as well, which has made their popularity ratings tank. So, I mean, you know, it's an effort by Prince Harry and Meghan to make themselves, you know, a bit more likeable again.
It's interesting she's put out this statement, though, because the criticism about the website had nothing to do with the design.
Well, it did have something to do with the design, as in the sense that it had the royal crest, and people are speculating, or at least alleging, that is one step too far, and making out as if both Meghan and Harry are using their royal connections for financial gain. That's the accusation. They would disagree with that, and a source very much says, according to the Mail, that Harry and Meghan's titles, as in the Sussexes, is their legal name, and they have a right to use it. They're not capitalising on their royal connection.
It's interesting, given that their popularity has collapsed so much in this country specifically since leaving as senior members of the royal family. I wonder, might they have been able to do some of their more commercial enterprises while still under the arm of the royal family, or would that have been impossible?
No, that would have been impossible, Tom, because the Sandringham Agreement in 2020 very much said that the agreement was that Harry and Meghan could not, at the same time as being part of the royal family, pursue their own commercial endeavours. They had to be fully out, not half in, half out, and they couldn't use the word royal to get commercial deals. So there's absolutely no way that would have happened. But the argument is now, have they crossed the line into that, using their royal titles for commercial gain?
Well, wish them well for the Invictus Games.
Yes, and
Good
that's
stuff.
about it. That's it. Cameron, thank you very much for joining us.
Harsh, vicious.
Well, no, I think I wish them well for the Invictus Games, because that's about other people. Do I wish them well about their podcast? Possibly not.
It's interesting.
Do I wish Harry has lots of book sales? I don't see why I should.
It's interesting, she said, plus they're Canadian, so I'm a fan.
What's that supposed to mean?
The designer.
The Canadians better... I've got nothing against the Canadians. Some of my best friends are Canadians.
Yeah, well, I guess she worked in Canada, but...
I suppose she did, yeah.
Yeah.
But very much West Coast Canada, sort of Californian extension Canada.
Well, coming up, more on the Labour polling, of course. A little bit of a sobering read for Starmer. He'll be scratching his head, won't he?
He will.
What to do.
After the headlines with Tatiana.
Tom, thank you. Your top stories from the GB newsroom. The rate of inflation remains at 4%, the same as in December, despite forecasters having predicted a rise. Figures from the Office for National Statistics found that food prices fell on a monthly basis for the first time since September 2021. Shadow Chancellor Rachel Reeves criticised the figure, saying Conservatives cannot fix the economy because they are the reason it's broken. The Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, has insisted the economy has turned a corner, though, as he held his first Business Council meeting of the year. However, Chancellor Jeremy Hunt says more needs to be done.
Inflation never falls in a straight line, and although it's welcome that it hasn't gone up today, it is still double the target level of 2%. And we're not going to be able to relieve pressure on families until we hit that target and the Bank of England feels able to reduce interest rates. So this is a time to stick to a plan that is clearly working, but we need to make sure that we really get to that end point of inflation at 2%.
Train drivers on Northern and LNER will walk out on the 1st of March and ban overtime for 3 days in a separate row to the national pay dispute. Meanwhile, train drivers at 5 rail operators have voted to continue taking strike action for 6 months. ASLEF announced that its members on Chiltern, C2C, East Midlands, Northern and Transpennine railways had overwhelmingly backed carrying on with action. And pressures mounting for Sir Keir Starmer as a second Labour Party candidate has been suspended following accusations of anti-Semitism. Graham Jones allegedly suggested British people who volunteered to fight with Israel Defence Forces should be locked up. It comes a day after Labour withdrew support for the party's candidate for the Rochdale by-election, Azhar Ali, for suggesting Israel had taken the October 7th Hamas assault as a pretext to invade Gaza. Sir Keir vowed yesterday that his party has changed under his rule. For the latest stories, you can sign up to GB News Alerts by scanning the QR code on your screen, or you can go to gbnews.com/alerts.
I'm Christopher Hope.
And I'm Gloria Di Piero, bringing you
PMQ's live here on GB News. Every Wednesday, we'll bring you live coverage of Prime Minister's questions when Rishi Sunak and Sir Keir Starmer go head-to-head in the House of Commons.
We'll be asking our viewers and listeners to submit the questions that they would like to put to the Prime Minister, and we'll put that to our panel of top politicians in our Westminster studio.
That's PMQ's live here on GB News, Britain's election channel.
The Camilla Tominey Show, Sunday mornings from 9:30.
Questions to be answered, and there seem to be a significant amount, does once again point its way to a public inquiry into exactly what happened in this case. Starmer's called for that. Would you call for that too?
I certainly think that first of all, there's one thing that's happening now. The NHS have to order an independent inquiry. That's been done. So they've got to look at all the whys and wherefores of what happened with this man. If it appears that we're not getting sufficient depth and breadth to this, then I think having an inquiry with all the powers that brings would be extremely advantageous. What I don't want is some long-winded inquiry that will take years, by which time other people will have been put at risk and maybe other lives have lost. We know what the problems are here, Camilla. Law's been passed on this. This is all about making sure on the ground we implement the highest degree of monitoring in order to ensure the safety of the public.
Has care in the community failed? I mean, it seems oxymoronic to say that it's care in the community in this case. We know that the number of psychiatric care beds has been slashed from 52,000 back in 2001 to 24,000 now. I've anecdotally, because I wrote my column about this in The Telegraph yesterday, received quite a lot of correspondence from people saying the situation with care in the community is dire. People aren't being adequately monitored. Was it a mistake to close down all of those mental institutions?
I don't think we should go back to those days when we had those appalling institutions where we just lock people away and forget about them, and not just mental health people, but autistic people and disabled people. Horrific way to treat individuals, and you know I campaign on that a lot.
I know.
However, I think if we move into a more community-based approach, which can be really good for many, many people who are on the spectrum and on that scale of mental health, we have to remember there will be a small but significant number who will continue to pose a danger. And that's why monitoring is so important.
I'm Michelle Dewberry, and I'm not here to tell you what to think. I'd much rather hear what you have to say. So, send in your opinions to gbviews@gbnews.com. Keep them clean, and you never know, I might read them out. With my panel here on Jubes & Co, we debate, we get stuck into the issues of the day on a show where all views are welcome, especially yours. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Good afternoon, Britain. It is 2:37, and we're talking about the Labour Party's polling figures. What has happened to them? Well, joining us now is, I'm delighted to say, the GB News senior political commentator, Nigel Nelson, and former Chief of Staff to the Chancellor of Exchequer, James Price. Nigel, let's start with you. 7 points down in Savanta's polling. We've, earlier this hour, spoke to the person behind the poll. It's a pretty significant drop.
Yeah, I think it is, and really, what we need to see is next week's polls to see how they turn out after this week's debacle, and then see over the next month if things actually significantly change. I mean, it does seem to me that when we argue about election dates, I've always thought they've been laying the groundwork for a May the 2nd. It only works if the polls are much, much closer. So we might get an early election on the basis of this. We'll have to see.
That's an interesting one.
Oh, God, more elections coming up. It feels like the other one was just around the corner recently. I think that this is really a symbol that people are now starting to look at Starmer and the Labour Party. Right, an election has to be really this year. The PM, I think, suggested it's probably going to be in the latter half of the year, but it may get brought forward now. People are going, right, OK, this guy Starmer, pretty boring guy, but it looks like he might be the PM. Let's start having a look at this. And at just that moment, the horrible spectre of anti-Semitism rears its head again, and some other stuff about him flip-flopping, the 28 billion a year extra, they've now scrapped that. What do Labour actually stand for? Is it going to be the smallest manifesto ever? And that kind of whiff of desperation, I just want to get into power at all costs. It's a big turn-off when people don't think this guy stands for very much as it is.
Yeah, it's interesting because there are certain flashbacks to Theresa May for me. Theresa May led in the poll, 25-point lead in the polls. She was going to sweep the country, and everyone thought, wow, she caused this election. And within quite a small space of time, her sort of reputation for being boring, predictable, strong and stable, all things that Sir Keir Starmer is trying to project himself as, sort of melted away due to a U-turn and this sense of weakness and wobbliness. That's a real risk for Sir Keir Starmer.
Well, yeah, and in Theresa May's case, a rotten manifesto. I mean, I think what was surprising about when they went for that election was how bad the Tory manifesto was, if you remember the dementia tax and things like that, and how good, in fact, the Labour one was.
Or how under-scrutinised it was.
Well, I mean, it depends how you look at it. I just thought that I was really surprised that Labour had put together, under Jeremy Corbyn, such a good manifesto. By 2019, it wasn't. That they were promising the earth, and it no longer was credible.
Free Wi-Fi for everyone.
Yeah, basically, yes. But I mean, it was. Some of the figures didn't add up by 2019. They felt they had to go further. But it was those two things, and Theresa May not being a great performer on the campaign trail, all those set for an implosion.
Yeah.
And that's why I think that things went wrong.
But James, difficult job for Keir Starmer. He's got to build and maintain a very large coalition of voters who potentially have not voted Labour recently.
Yeah, absolutely right. It's a big mountain because they lost so badly in 2019, fortunately, under Corbyn. Where do you target? Where do you go? Do you go and try and get back the overused phrase, the red wall votes they lost last time? Do you try and go down kind of disaffected anti-Brexit type people in the south? Do you go for Lib Dems? How did this strategy kind of work?
Up until today, Sir Keir Starmer has had a very easy answer to that. Everything. We're going to appeal to absolutely everyone by saying absolutely nothing. And I suppose now that the microscope's a bit more on the Labour Party, they're sort of having to say what they do stand for, or maybe standing for one thing on Sunday and a different thing on Monday. It does make them perhaps have to narrow their coalition.
Right, well, as the great lady Margaret Thatcher said, the problem with standing in the middle of the road is you get hit from both sides, right? And I think that we saw with 2019, where that kind of historic link between lots of seats and the Labour Party got broken, partly broken by the Brexit referendum. Then Boris came and swept in all these people. They lent him a vote. They've been really upset with the Conservatives for a while now. But people are going, well, do I go Labour? Do I go Lib Dem? Those sorts of things were all broken down. There's reform coming into play as well. And I think that's why we see these big volatile shifts in polling as well. And it looks like it's set to continue for the next few months.
Nigel, it does appear as though the Labour Party can only really agree on tax breaks for non-doms, they don't like that, and slapping taxes on private schools.
Yeah, I mean, those are the tax rises that they've actually announced.
What else is there? Because, you know, they flip-flopped on nationalisation of various things.
Yeah,
tuition fees.
We've got rail left. That's the only one, I agree, yeah.
They seem rather confused and divided over foreign affairs.
To say the least.
You know, is more taxes on the rich, and is that enough?
Well, I mean, I think that first of all, the non-dom tax, provided it works, is actually a good tax to have.
Well, there's a lot of different sort
there are a lot of different views of that, but it would raise £3.2 billion, which is not insignificant. I mean, we're now going to get an awful lot of Labour flip-flopping. That will be the accusation from the Tories. I do regret the fact that Keir Starmer went back on the £28 billion pledge for a green industry revolution, because I think
the non-doms wouldn't pay for that.
No, they're not. Well, they wouldn't have to. We'd have actually got that from borrowing, and we don't know what the situation will be by 2027 when you'd have actually borrowed that money. The point was that was, forgetting about whether you like net zero or not, that was really important for his economic growth policy, because it could have created 500,000 jobs, £1 trillion of business for the UK, provided they led the way in green technology.
Nigel, I think that's wishful thinking, James.
Yeah, I think the problem is that, my job's in government, it was all about policy and how this stuff is going to affect in real life. But all of that stuff comes from principles and ideology and starting points. Politicians have to get into politics because they believe in those things and they believe that's how it's actually going to help people, right? I mentioned Thatcher. Like her or loathe her, you knew what she believed in. She believed in Adam Smith. She believed in all these sorts of ideas of letting people keep more of what they earn. And then you turn that into policy and see how that affects people's lives. And since then, it's been hard to know what politicians think, right? Rishi Sunak's got to lay out really what his kind of conservatism is like, how that's going to help people. Starmer's got to do the same thing. And at the moment, people have absolutely no idea what Starmer believes in at all.
And yet, the same could have been said of Tony Blair. Tony Blair stood in the middle of the road and he won a massive election victory.
Yeah, but also I think that James has pointed absolutely right there. He had an underlying philosophy that he adopted, which we haven't really had since. Cameron tried to copy it with Big Society and couldn't articulate it, and it just went by the board. I would say that Thatcher and Blair, if I was naming the two best prime ministers of my lifetime, it would be them. And for that reason, they actually had something they believed in and went out and got it. So what Tony Blair was doing was saying, right, let's nick the best bits of free market capitalism, best bits of social democracy, put them together. And that actually worked with his third way and won him 3 elections.
Yes, what is Starmerism and what is Sunakism?
Well, they don't exist.
We don't know. They don't exist. We won't be learning about what Sunakism was in the history books, maybe.
Although we say this, I'm completely addicted to old political documentaries, and there are lots of people sitting on chat shows like this in the early 2000s who go, well, no one will say what Blair... We all know what Thatcherism is. Who on earth will say what Blairism is? And they sort of use the term Blairism as a sort of pejorative or a pretend made-up word, and yet now everyone says it sort of as if it's a thing. I wonder if perhaps the formula to having an ism after your name if you're a Prime Minister is, one, be in the job for quite a bit of time,
right.
And number 2, wait about a decade and then people will start saying that you have an ism.
Well, it does help if you have some principles, at least. But thank you very much, Nigel Nelson and James Price. Now, the Housing Secretary wants to allow housing extensions without planning permission. Joy to the ears of young Tom Harwood. But could it spark a middle-class civil war? You're watching Good Afternoon Britain on GB News.
2024, a battleground year.
The year the nation decides.
As the parties gear up their campaigns for the next general election.
Who will be left standing when the British people make one of the biggest decisions of their lives?
Who will rise?
And who will fall?
Let's find out together.
For every moment, the highs, the lows, the twists and turns.
We'll be with you for every step of this journey.
In 2024, GB News is Britain's election channel.
Good Afternoon Britain. Weekdays from midday.
Francis, Just Stop Oil have in the past broken the law. I remember distinctly the Dartford crossing. That ended up with 2 jailed, I believe, if I remember correctly. Is it ever justified in your view?
Yeah, thanks so much for having me on. I mean, I would have to say yes. I mean, we're trying to preserve my life, your lives, the lives of your family, and it's not just the planet that we're trying to protect, it's the lives of millions of people. And, we know from history that we have to break the law in order to put pressure on the government and to be listened to.
No one would doubt your sincerity in your views. You genuinely believe in what you fight for. But there are others who think differently. For example, there are Islamist extremists who believe that people will go to hell unless they convert to Islam. They will sincerely, perhaps, break the law in order to force people to convert. In their view, they might be saving people's lives for eternity. There might be abortion activists who say that babies are being murdered and to save their lives we need to break the law to stop people having abortions. Why do you get to say that your moral conviction is the one that's right and other people's individual moral conviction are those that are wrong?
So what's really integral to the Just Stop Oil campaign is the fact that it is a non-violent campaign. That's what separates us from the examples that you've just given. We're absolutely dedicated non-violence, both as a tactic and as a principle. So though we might be breaking the law...
If individuals take it upon themselves to break the law for whatever their course is, surely the way that we decide what society wants in general is democratic and within the law.
Well, of course, we know also that protest is absolutely integral to maintaining and upholding a democracy, and in particular, non-violent protest. I mean, I really can't express to you how severe this situation is, and I'm sure you know this.
I'm Michelle Dewberry, and I'm not here to tell you what to think. I'd much rather hear what you have to say. So, send in your opinions to gbviews@gbnews.com. Keep them clean, and you never know, I might read them out. With my panel here on Jubes & Co, we debate, we get stuck into the issues of the day on a show where all views are welcome, especially yours. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
It's 2:49 in the afternoon. You're watching Good Afternoon Britain with me, Emily and Tom. So let's talk about Michael Gove's home extension shake-up. Why
yes,
not?
Not his personal home extension, but yours.
Yes, I'm not interested in his home extension. But will it ignite a middle-class civil war with essentially neighbours facing off their neighbours over, you know, ghastly extensions?
Well, joining us to discuss this is GB News senior political commentator Nigel Nelson and the former Chief of Staff to the Chancellor of the Exchequer, James Price. James, one of your other hats is that you work at the Adam Smith Institute. That's an economic think tank that has been promoting stuff like this.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that in an ideal world, right, let's imagine what Britain would look like. It would look, in some parts, like cute little Cotswold villages that would be untouched for hundreds of years, that kind of thing. Bits of it would look like Canary Wharf, right, as we've got now, big, beautiful skyscrapers, as perhaps Donald Trump would describe them. Most things,
beautiful.
In an ideal world, maybe it would look like Chelsea and Knightsbridge in West London, right? They're quite dense in terms of how many people you can fit into that kind of space, but 7 stories, sometimes a gentle density. They're attractive-looking buildings with nice materials made for them, and it creates that sort of sense of community and neighbourliness, right? Because of all kinds of housing policy restrictions, and because of lots more people being there than we've actually got for houses at the moment, you've got a big problem. But we can't have attractive properties in quite the same way. House prices are far too high for people to get onto the housing ladder, and all kinds of other problems, largely caused by policy and legislation getting in the way of building stuff. And so this is one step to try and get this approved. And if you can't build lots more houses in places because you've got people complaining about them being built at all, well, at least they're trying to say, well, maybe you can build up a little bit or you can expand out a little bit to try and have the size of family that you want.
Yeah, it's probably just worth highlighting what exactly this relaxation of planning rules is. So, as James says, homeowners can build wider and taller extensions, including L-shaped loft kitchen without permission, OK. 50% land limitation scrapped for extensions and unlimited loft conversions allowed. Now, I can foresee quite a lot of disputes on residential roads over this type
which
of thing.
there already are when people want to build extensions. I mean, the loft conversion is fine because obviously that's self-contained. I mean, the problem with the whole with Michael Gove trying to sort of do this right across the country is that local councillors complain that the three Ps that would give them the biggest headaches. So that's potholes, parking, and planning. And for the most part, I do think local authorities are better place to work out what their planning should be. And so the idea of just making a blanket kind of thing across Britain, not so sure about. Also, his idea about brownfield, that according to the National Federation of Builders, we don't have enough brownfield land to start building on anyway. And if you do build residential properties on there, what happens to your GP surgeries, your sports centres, your shops, things like that?
Now, it must be said that there is already a level at which people can, without permission, extend their houses. And this is going to be expanded. Shall we just have a little look at the radical changes that Michael Gove wants to introduce? The dotted line is where it's going to be. It's 1 metre more on the back of a house.
I'll go back to
or
the other one.
1 little bit more, shunting an extension at the top to the end, or turning a 2 sort of extensions into an L-shape extension, as Emily was talking about. I mean, this doesn't actually look particularly radical, James.
No, absolutely not. But I think that the housing crisis that we've got in this country is so bad now that any, even modest attempt like this is going to be welcomed by those who want a little bit more space, and it's going to be fiercely fought by people who are sometimes known as NIMBYs. And I maybe make myself a little unpopular here, but the problem you've got is that if people already own their home, they obviously have lots of incentives against either more homes being built nearby or other homes getting bigger because it's going to impinge on them. Fine, that makes perfect sense. But for lots of us who are really struggling to get onto the housing ladder, who can't afford our homes at the moment because not enough are being built, we don't necessarily get as much of a say in that kind of planning process, right? If all the people who wanted to be able to buy their own homes were able to weigh in on planning considerations, then you'd find a much bigger voice for building a lot more. And as it is, the property rights of people are outweighing the rights of those maybe to ever get to own their own homes.
Yeah, that's true. But I think one of the major issues in practice is that you get these developments that are totally a mismatch for the area that they're plonked in. And, of course, residents are going to be irritated by it because they're so ugly so much of the time. They're not in keeping with the rest of the road or street or community or whatever. Which
is why local authorities should be the ones who actually set the planning to make sure...
And then they say no so much too.
Well, I mean, that's what I mean about that I'm not against sort of lifting some of the planning restrictions. What I'm saying is that the local authorities are the ones to make sure they don't do what you've just said.
Well, I guess this is a conversation that many streets will be having, perhaps at many dinner parties. But that's it for us. But don't go anywhere.
Thanks, James. Thanks, Nigel.
Yes, thank you to both. But Martin Daubney is up next. Martin, what's coming up?
Thank you, guys. I've got a superb exclusive today. Josie and Ted Saunders, the pensioners living in Northamptonshire, asked by their council to leave their home, threatened with eviction, to make way for asylum seekers. A case that sums up broken Britain. We'll have an exclusive chat with them. We've got lots more, including Labour's crisis carrying on. But, of course, that's all coming after your latest weather forecast.
A brighter outlook with Box Solar, sponsors of weather on GB News.
Hello there, welcome to your latest GB News weather update with me, Annie, from the Met Office. There'll be further outbreaks of rain for many of us through the rest of the day, and it's going to be a very cloudy but an exceptionally mild few days. That's as we've got this very mild air pushing up from the south, spreading across the country, but the far north of Scotland will still be holding on to that colder air for the time being, and there will be the best of the sunshine across the far north of Scotland through the rest of the day as well. However, elsewhere, there'll be a lot of cloud around. Outbreaks of rain, mainly across parts of Northern Ireland, central southern Scotland, northern England too, as well as the south coast where we could see some quite heavy bursts. But elsewhere where we don't see the rain, there's still going to be quite a lot of cloud around, but it will be feeling very mild through the evening and overnight as well. We'll see another band of rain push in from the southwest through the course of the night. Ahead of that, in the far north of Scotland, could get down to 1 or 2 degrees, so a chillier start to the evening. But elsewhere, across many areas of the UK, it'll be another cloudy, mild and damp night. So it could be a bit of a murky start tomorrow. There's a lot of low cloud around for the next few days, but we'll see the worst of the rain through Thursday pushing in from the west this time. So eastern areas will probably get away with a largely dry day. And if we do start to see any breaks in the cloud, any sunny spells coming through, temperatures could climb as high as 16, possibly 17 degrees, which is exceptionally mild for the time of year. But further west, there is a risk of some localised flooding. See you later.
That warm feeling inside from Boxed Boilers, sponsors of weather on GB News.
In the GB Newsroom, we bring you the news as it happens. With our team of dedicated journalists across the UK, we're ready to give you accurate reporting every day. When the news breaks, we'll be there. with bulletins on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Lee Anderson's Real World, Fridays from 7 p.m.
Dr. Jane Jones, who's the clinical lead for Care After Combat.
Yeah.
Jane, thanks for coming. And just tell me a little bit about your organisation. What do you do?
OK, well, thank you for having me here so we can talk about Care After Combat. So we are an organisation, a charity, who work into the prison system, working with military veterans who've somehow got involved with the justice system and...
So there's quite a high population of ex-servicemen and women in our prisons. Why is that, do you think?
So 2014, the government did a review of who was resident in UK prisons, and what they found were that military veterans are the highest occupational group, and this obviously raises some concerns. Yeah. So the government wanted to do something about that, and so they supported Care After Combat initially just as a scoping exercise, really, to see if there was any way we could help these men and women actually, understand the problems that led to offending behaviour and go on to lead successful